Ladies and gentlemen, today is September 28th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello, how are you?
Yo, doing well.
How's the subathon going?
Cruising, beginning of week 3. This is the final week. We've been doing a lot of different stuff. Just played some Tekken 8. Huge hype.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that game is very fun. I don't normally play fighting games. I've played some decently in the past, back when we played on Xbox mainly and not PC. But since being a PC gamer, I haven't really invested much time in fighting games. But Tekken 8 and Street Fighter 6 are both really good games. So played both of those. And we did Dota games with viewers earlier. Yesterday we did a 10 beer tasting. And it was controversial, and the beers scored very low based on what we could get. So it's a pretty interesting, funny time.
My condolences.
Yeah. I'm not really a beer drinker normally. I can definitely enjoy it. But it has a lot of calories plus alcohol, so it's like a relatively inefficient way to get tipsy or drunk for the amount of beverage that you have to drink, the amount of calories that you have to take in. But it tastes really good, so there's that. Left to my own devices, I'll probably have half of one beer per month, so maybe an actual beer every 2 months. A lot of times if I'm at a restaurant and I choose alcohol, I'll probably choose red wine. That's probably my main.
Oh.
Yeah.
How fancy.
Yeah. I like a more bitter red, like a Merlot or a Cab or something like that. But yeah, we had the beer tasting. We've done a bunch of Jimothy videos, and one of the new breakthroughs for our YouTube content is I have a lapel microphone, so the audio quality doing outside stuff is way better. It's a pretty nice one, so that's all refreshed. Cool. So we unlocked the goal of redoing my initial intro Neuro video, where I'm like in the woods reading Sun Tzu Art of War in a French accent, being silly. That's at this point a 10-year-old video, and it'll be remade 2025 in high def. So I think that was 1,350 subs, which we reached. Good job, Chad. Good job, Chad. Can we get a link of that video? Here it is. Oh, yeah. Chat, watch that. Get a remake of that.
Have you gotten around the Sins of a Solar Empire yet?
I have not, but it's on the list. Added it to our goals list.
대군주가 더 필요하다. 광물이 부족하다.
Got to get water.
You need a water break? That's all good. I haven't really seen too much talk of stuff during the week. Not like any mega huge items, but I've been very busy playing all the different video games, so...
It's the kind of problem you want to have.
Yeah, that's true. Gratitude for that.
Well, yeah, I think it wasn't too active a week. There were some stories that developed, but nothing really big, nothing breakout per se that's off trend that makes it sufficiently notable to really focus on. So we can kind of freewheel again. Most of what I got is another highlight reel, some stuff on the US economy, a trade update, and then some Ukraine-Israel stuff. Nothing out of the usual. A little bit of Argentina, since they've been in the news. So yeah, whatever you kind of feel like.
What is Argentina doing?
What it always does, screwing up its economy. Yeah, they had elections, I want to say a couple weeks ago. There were local elections in Buenos Aires, I think is what I read. And Malaya's party, Malay is the president, did not do well, which isn't really all that surprising. I think Buenos Aires is kind of more politically aligned with the opposition, with the Peronist opposition. But markets did not take it well. They took it as an early sign that Malay's agenda was in danger, that he would not be able to get the political support in the legislature that he needs in order to really cement his agenda as policy, which is what would need to happen for markets to really have full confidence that his changes in economic management are actually going to stick around long enough to have a long-term economic impact. So there's been some capital flight. There's been some pressure on the Argentine peso. It's typical Argentine type stuff if you've been following their economy for any length of time. So there's been some question about how the government is going to arrest those problems, how they're going to deal with those problems. And in the midst of that, suddenly, out of nowhere, as is so often the case on so many issues, the Trump administration decides to intervene for reasons that are known only to them. And what they decided to do was to offer the Malay government a $20 billion swap agreement. Are you familiar with swap agreements?
No, what is that?
So basically, these are agreements between central banks in which they agree to a certain amount of money that they are willing to exchange each other. So obviously, the Federal Reserve has access to a significant amount of US dollars. Argentina's central bank has access to a significant amount of Argentine pesos. So what they can do is agree to exchange them for equivalent value. And while that may not sound useful, it's actually quite useful when a given currency is in decline, because that'll give you access to hard currency that you can then spend to try to prop up your currency or otherwise engage in whatever interventions are necessary to rebuild market confidence in order to stop the decline in your currency. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's sort of like a loan where you're gambling on bad money with solid money to hopefully make money in the future. So the US has money and they want to invest that, and Argentina's economy is not doing well, and it's so bad that it's probably likely to improve just by the way things swing back and forth. So it's like saying, okay, we'll give you money for your money, and we know your money isn't as valuable now, but we think that it will be.
Kind of. That's pretty close, but it's not really an investment per se. It is literally just a swap of currency. Hypothetically, there's not anything stopping both central banks from doing that anyway, but having an agreement in place makes it much easier legally, so you can do it very quickly. And when there's a crisis, you need to be able to do it quickly. So it's generally better to have swap agreements in place before a crisis happens, so that you can do it quite readily. So it's more about just making sure that you have access quickly to a lot of hard currency, something that's not declining in value. And this is done not as an investment, but just as a way to support an ailing economy. This is the kind of thing that's not abnormal during, say, a big crisis like with the Great Recession back in the day, or when there's a debt crisis afflicting a developing economy. These are the kinds of things that central banking institutions will use as tools in order to address the crisis. So a quick and easy injection of hard currency is very helpful, because that's not the kind of, you're not going to be able to get $20 billion as a developing economy with a reputation for economic mismanagement from private sector actors. They're going to see you as too risky. So you can't go to like JP Morgan or whatever and say, hey, our economy is having trouble. Would you lend us a bunch of US dollars so that we can try and do something? Maybe buy our own currency to try to stop the decline. Or some form of industrial policy, or whatever needs to be done. Most of the time, private banks will say no, unless the agreement is on very, very favorable terms to them. So a swap agreement, by contrast, ensures that you do, in case of emergency, have a break glass when in need of hard currency option. So less investment, more tool is a public policy tool. That's the best way to think of it, I would argue.
I see.
But you are correct in that while the peso is in decline right now, hypothetically it could increase later, and so the swap could recover the value that was lost on the part of the Federal Reserve by swapping US dollars for a declining currency. So it's not necessarily going to be a money-losing proposition for the US side there. Although if it is, that's kind of acceptable. That is the risk you take when you sign a swap agreement. It may be that when the counterparty activates the agreement during an emergency, you're going to end up losing a certain amount of money. So you just kind of have to bake that into your calculus. If you're willing to take on the corresponding risk, then you go ahead and do it, because the overall benefits to overall global and bilateral financial stability are generally worth it. The question here, though, is why the Trump administration kind of jumped in with this, and the suspicion is that it has less to do with actual public policy than it does with Trump wanting to help out somebody that he perceives as a political ally, that being President Milei. And that's interesting to me, because they're not really natural allies. I've been reading a lot in media that they have a lot in common politically, but that's really not true. Like, they're not the same thing. They're kind of similar in that they're very charismatic. I can see that much. But Milei is not actually a populist, per se. Trump is very much a populist, but not Milei. In fact, the Peronists that he kind of rails against, they're generally the more populist ones. Milei is much more of a iconoclast. He's kind of a libertarian. Very rare in Latin America to see libertarians get a lot of political support, let alone win power. But he managed to pull it off. And he did so while making a lot of promises that were anathema to what would have been considered, traditional red lines in politics there. You're not really supposed to talk about significantly gutting the budget or austerity or that kind of stuff. There have been conservative politicians that have won power and did that, but generally they didn't win because they ran on doing that. Generally they would lie about it, or they would obfuscate how much of it they would do. Milei said, no, I'm going to gut government spending. Very unusual for somebody to be so open about that, and even more unusual for them to actually win an election on it. So that's really not populism. Populism is really more about telling people what they want to hear and doing what they want to do. And generally that means spending more government money on whatever pet project, whatever aggrieved interest group is driving populism in a given political era. So in that sense, Milei and Trump are really just awkward bedfellows, but presumably because they have some kind of personal relationship, Trump feels somewhat invested in Milei, hence his interest. That's about the only way I can really make it make sense, because otherwise it doesn't really add up. I think the Trump administration did try to portray it as being something to do with national security, because Argentina actually is a designated major non-NATO ally for the United States. That's an official legal designation that gives countries certain privileges vis-a-vis the procurement process involving US defense equipment, among other things. And Argentina is on the short list of those countries. So it is a strategic ally in the region. So it does make some sense for the US government to be concerned about the Argentine economy, but Argentina has gone through far worse economic crises over the past couple decades, and they did not warrant the same special interest from a sitting president. So this is a bit unusual with regard to Trump's and his administration's direct involvement in the swap agreement and apparent interest in trying to help out the Milei administration. I'm still trying to kind of make it make sense overall, but that's pretty much at this point the best I can do.
I wonder if Trump isn't really analyzing it on a political alignment setting and more on like a personality thing. Like he likes people who are big personalities. It makes him feel at home in this space.
I mean, that makes as much sense as any explanation I've heard. The only issue there is that he's dealt with lots of big personalities, but not all of them get along with him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about being charismatic. It's also about having a special rapport on an individual level with Trump himself. And just how that seems to happen varies considerably from country to country, from leader to leader. If somebody could figure that out, they could make a lot of money consulting, because I'm sure there's a lot of leaders around the world that would be interested at this point.
Call Shinzo Abe's wife.
Sorry, what?
Call Shinzo Abe's wife. Didn't she do a good job of wrangling him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she was a very good Trump whisperer. I think she still does a little bit of consulting for the Japanese government. Shinzo Abe and his wife were very good. The Italian prime minister, I think, has done pretty well. I forget her name, Meloni. Prime Minister Meloni has done pretty good. Neither Zelensky nor Putin have quite managed it. Malay obviously has.
Why do you think Putin hasn't? Because I thought Trump likes Putin.
He pretends to. I don't think he actually cares. I think Trump's whole perspective is that strong leaders secretly run the world. He's very much got a strongman theory of international relations. And so his thinking is that if you're not a strong leader of a strong nation, then you don't really matter, and you can kind of just be pushed around at will. But if you're a strong leader, then you have to be dealt with as an equal. And so Trump tends to take an obsequious approach to dealing with people he considers to be strong leaders. So like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, etc. These kinds of leaders he believes have to be handled in a very particular way. You know, you have to be very deferential, you have to be kind, you have to be respectful, and only then can you kind of deal with them on an equal footing and then reach a deal, some kind of grand handshake agreement that'll resolve whatever issue that they're interested in. So that kind of perspective, I think, explains why Trump approaches Putin the way he does. It's not about liking, it's about a kind of strongman mutual respect. It's the kind of thing that would really not be out of place here in the American South. There is kind of an honor code embedded in Southern culture in the United States. And so, you know, your handshake means a lot. So that kind of thinking, I think, lends itself to the strongman logic. It's not really about systems, systematic explanations. It's not about interlinked interests and how to reach a solution that benefits everybody. It's more about just meeting them head on, looking them in the eye, and then dealing from a position of strength and respect and reaching an agreement correspondingly.
Sounds very performative.
People do take it seriously at a local level. Like individuals, especially in rural areas, still very much think like that. So, you know, they will make a deal with you based off of a handshake if they trust you and respect you. That is a real thing. And it can be a real thing in international relations, depending on the degree of mutual respect. But the issue with Russia and Putin, for one, I don't think they respect Trump. Trump has not done himself any favors with regard to his reputation by the way he acts and deals with problems. I don't think most actors overseas see him as a serious president or a serious actor in international affairs. I think they see him as a potential threat because he has been erratic and he doesn't seem to mind using violence. But there's only so much erraticness that you can have and exhibit in a foreign policy before people kind of start keeping you at arm's distance because they don't know how you react and don't really trust you to be entirely rational. So Trump's kind of preferred approach to have a pseudo madman policy and foreign policy kind of has come back to bite him in that regard. You know, there is some merit to the madman idea, but it has to be managed the right way. You know, you do have to have a certain amount of deftness to the way you approach it. And you know, the Trump administration in either this form or its first term form has never been known for being deft. They seem to really struggle with that. So for those reasons, I don't think Putin or the Russian government respects Trump or takes his entreaties all that seriously. The other problem, though, is that Putin himself is not really kind of this honorific school of strongman politics. He definitely is a strongman style of leader, but his approach to governance is more authoritarian. You can kind of see how the way he deals with domestic politics is more rooted in the Soviet approach, which is more about repression than it is about building consensus. Sorry, what?
Throwing them out of windows.
Yeah. There's a lot more of that than there is in the American South. That it is a recurring issue in Russia. So, that's not to say that Russian democracy did not have its heyday, and that Putin does pay nominal deference to some popular democratic aspects of Russian politics. There are things he does to pander to the crowd that the Soviets would have never done, basically. So he is relatively more responsive to the public than the Soviets were, but at the same time, as his government has gotten more unpopular over decades, he has leaned more on those more traditional authoritarian approaches to dealing with dissent than, say, Yeltsin did in the 90s, or that even he did early in his rule. So that approach, that sort of KGB Soviet authoritarian approach to dealing with domestic politics, does not really lend itself to this sort of meeting of equals strongman style. It's really more about dominance. And so you're either dominant or you're dominated. There's not really a lot of in between. And so with Trump and the United States, Russia is in a much weaker position. They can't dominate the United States. So that means the US is inherently a threat, because hypothetically we could dominate them. And so the approach to that situation in such circumstances is to try to delay that as much as possible. You either cut a deal and become part of the more powerful actors' patronage network, or alternatively, you try to basically keep them away from you. You try to prevent them from acting on their power potential. And so in Putin's case, you can see that with how he deals with Trump, with the way he strings him along. Trump has said multiple times he wants peace in Ukraine, he wants to cut a deal, maybe even a deal that's preferential for Russia, but Putin doesn't really care about that. He continues to just kick the can down the road. Because for him, the main objective in Ukraine is to ensure Ukraine stays in the Russian sphere of influence. And Trump may or may not facilitate that. I haven't really seen the details of the so-called peace talks that have taken place, but from what I've read and heard about them, they don't seem all that serious. And I think perceiving that in Moscow, the Russian government and Putin prefers to take their current approach to dealing with the problem, which is via kinetic operations, via the war. And until the Trump administration and really the US government's credibility on the matter is restored, I don't think that they're going to continue to do anything other than string along the US government in the negotiations. So in between not taking the Trump administration seriously and preferring not to deal with them as an equal because they kind of can't, the US has more cards to play there. Putin government isn't going to really give Trump anything that the Trump administration does not pressure them very directly into giving. And from what I've seen, the Trump administration is not really interested in getting more involved in the Ukraine conflict. They increasingly have taken more of a hands-off approach. They're not really withdrawing from the conflict. They are maintaining some degree of aid. They're kind of changing the character of that aid. They seem to be trying to make it more of a European thing that is more dependent on European money. But they are not significantly drawing down aid like they were hinting they might be doing earlier in the Trump administration. So it seems like their approach is, it seems like the Trump administration's thinking is that we tried to do this, we tried to get a peace deal quickly. It didn't work. The conflict doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. So we'll just periodically revisit this now and again, but otherwise ignore it. It'll just go on the back burner while they do other things.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the things that politically is fairly cheap to do, is to meet with someone and then talk about an agreement or an arrangement of some kind and then tacitly agree to it in the moment, and then just drag your feet and never follow up and or get it done.
Oh,
But
yeah.
when you're in their presence, you're like, oh yeah, this is a good idea. We'll totally do this. Great meeting with you. This has been awesome. A lot to think about here. Great. And then you go away and then make no progress toward that ever again.
Very common in international relations. If there's something somebody else wants you to do, you can always just play for time and hope they go away eventually. Developing countries do this very frequently. So Putin's Russia is no different in that regard. We'll see if it works for them. Given the famously short attention span of the Trump administration, I would bet that it does. But we'll see. Something to watch. But yeah, that's what's going on with Argentina.
Gotcha.
Yeah, from what I was reading, the Argentine peso is actually still, even with the recent decline, more valuable than it was at the start of Milei's administration. So it's not like it's a complete disaster right now, but it is in decline. And they do need to do something to restore market confidence. I'm just not sure what that'll be. The currency swap could help, but if markets are not impressed by that, then it won't matter. You can blow through a lot of money very quickly trying to prop up your own currency with money.
Mm-hmm. Spending money is easier than making money.
Very much so. Well, what did you want to get to next?
Was there anything else that's been happening in South America before we leave the region?
Petro, the president of Colombia, was in the news. He's in his last term. He's not running for office again. And so he's taken the opportunity to give a speech at the UN. There was a General Assembly at the UN this past week. And he gave a speech there in which he kind of railed against Donald Trump, saying he was a populist, that he was turning on democracy, that he was sliding into authoritarianism. It was pretty confrontational. It's not the kind of thing you hear a lot, given how concerned and scared a lot of leaders are of the Trump administration. But since he's on the way out anyway, he didn't really give a shit, and so he didn't hold back. So the Trump administration responded to that after he left New York anyway by revoking his visa. So he's not going to be able to go back, presumably. But that's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. It's just cheesy tit-for-tat rhetorical stuff. I don't think it's going to have a lot of bearing on U.S. relations with Colombia. Let's see, South America, Brazil. I think Jair Bolsonaro's son was convicted of something. Don't recall exactly what it was. But I think he's going to jail now, too.
Do you think they'll
See,
be
there-
roommates?
I don't know about that. Probably not. Would be my guess. Let's see. Chile has elections coming up. Chilean politics has been on quite the journey over the past 10 years. I think you might remember 2019, there were all those mass protests around the world. One of them was Chile. That was when they hiked the fare for buses, I think it was. Or maybe it was the subway. They hiked the rate for some kind of mass transportation. Somebody in chat probably remembers. And the result was mass protest. People flipped out because they were under a lot of pressure, basically, from economic inequality, in-migration from Venezuela, inflation. Just a number of issues have been persistent over time. And so that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So the mass protests happened, and eventually the government agreed to a constitutional convention in order to kind of appease the protesters' demands and open the door to significant reforms in Chile. So a couple years later, new elections are held for the Constitutional Convention, because, you know, everybody has to elect delegates and whatnot to go and negotiate the new Constitution. They have the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution they agreed to ended up getting shot down in the subsequent referendum. So after all that trouble, they finally get a chance to get a new Constitution, but people voted down. So nothing came of that.
What did they not like about it?
Let me see. It's been a while. There was a number of things. It was the constitutional conventional delegates were fairly left-wing in outlook. And so the document they wrote ended up being fairly left-wing, too much so for the general public. And the specific provisions kind of escaped me. I think there was one thing in there that an environmental provision that had to do with land that would make it very, very difficult to do anything without a major environmental review and without the permission of native groups. I think the Mapuche, I forget the group's name. And there was other stuff too, like I think guaranteed seats for women to some degree. Basically a kind of wish list for a lot of left-wing causes and activists. And, you know, some were more controversial than others. I don't think I can remember the most controversial. But it was enough that the general public, when they voted on it, voted against it. And so as a result, there was kind of a rightward shift in the politics. People were kind of dissatisfied with the direction the left seemed to want to go, and so there was some pushback. And the current president, who was the guy who not oversaw the Constitutional Convention directly, but he was the president while that was happening, and was part of that same left-wing wave. He's on his way out, and new elections are about to be held. And while it's looking kind of close, from what I was reading, the conservatives kind of have the inside track. So we've gone from mass protests against a conservative status quo to a left-wing wave to now kind of moving back towards the right over the course of, what would it be now, 6-some years.
Big swings.
Yeah, pretty significant. Let's see, I think Ecuador, I haven't really heard anything from Ecuador since the last election. I think the government there is still sort of a reformist conservative government. I think they were trying to kind of butter up to the Trump administration to try to help them with crime. I think I vaguely remember reading something to that effect in the past few months. Guyana is about to start oil exploitation. They found some big reserves like 10 whatever years ago, but it takes a long time to set up the relevant infrastructure. But they are finally going to get there, so that could have a big impact on their budget. Given that it's a fairly poor, corrupt country, probably most of it will be stolen. I think anybody familiar with development economics has heard of the oil curse. So I imagine Guyana is probably going to learn the hard way about that. Venezuela, we've talked about Venezuela before. They're doing some dumb kayfabe shit with the US government. I don't think there's a whole lot else going on right now for them.
Both pandering to their bases by talking shit.
Yeah, it's a mutual thing, especially when they're mutually antagonistic. You know, that especially gets people riled up. Very effective. Kind of like the rivalries in wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
Bolivia is about to have new elections. I don't know if we talked about it, but the Chavistas there have been kind of getting unpopular. The Chavista party has been in power almost continuously for like 20-some years, albeit with a brief break after the interim government that took power after the mass protests a few years ago. But when they finally did hold a new election, the Chavistas pretty much came right back, albeit without Evo Morales, who had been like the big Chavista leader over much of the past couple decades. Now they got a new guy in, which is probably needed. But Morales didn't really like that, so there's some tension within the movement between the pro-Morales crowd and the people who support the current president. I don't even remember his name. But regardless, the general population, even the native population, which has traditionally been a bedrock of support for the Chavista party and Morales, they've not fully turned on them, but they're losing support. They're bleeding support among that traditional bedrock. And it just kind of has to do with the fact that the Chavistas have been around a long time now, and they haven't really managed to do a whole lot. You know, they made significant gains in the early going, when they were able to implement broad-based reforms, specifically just taking government money and spending it on poor communities and helping them out. You know, that was a big change. But after that, they didn't really have a lot to offer. So a lot of what they run on more recently has just been on, you know, if you vote in the right, then they're just going to take us back to the bad old pre-Chavista days, which hypothetically could be true, but it's not really that inspiring a message. You know, vote for us so things don't get significantly worse. You know, people prefer an optimistic message. Vote for us and things will get much better. We'll do things for you. We'll make reforms. We'll make big changes, that kind of thing. And that seems to be what the Chavistas are struggling with in Bolivia right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if they still ended up winning anyway. This is still a relatively nascent trend from what I was reading. But they are getting to a point where they can't really pretend that they're the out group. You know, they're the outsiders, they're the underdogs. They've been in power for like 20 years. At this point, they are the establishment. And so when there's problems like with inflation, with economic underperformance, which are also problems in Bolivia, they can't really point the finger. Like, they're the ones in charge, so it was their responsibility. So that's been another source of erosion of traditional support for them, just economic difficulties. Some of that is just down to corruption, and some of it is down to international economic conditions. There's just been a broader wave of inflation over the past 5-some years. I don't know that either of those are necessarily the Chavistas' fault, because Bolivian politics has just always been corrupt. That's not new. The Chavistas said they would fix that, but unsurprisingly, they didn't. They're as much of that world as anybody else. And of course, Bolivia can't really control like the trajectory of the international economy and international inflation. So, you know, both of those things are kind of out of their power, but as we all know, that doesn't really matter. You know, people blame the incumbent regardless. And so because they're the incumbent, they're kind of getting the wrath and the blame for those prevailing negative economic conditions. So we'll see if there's a change in power in Bolivia, but probably not. And even if there is, probably nothing much will actually change. Really haven't heard anything from Uruguay recently. They're just such a quiet, well-behaved country. They very rarely make international headlines.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a bad thing. Compared to their neighbors.
Why are they more peaceful?
They kind of always have been, honestly. Uruguay used to be known as the Switzerland of South America. You know, they were always neutral, always minded their own business. They've just kind of been focused on doing their own thing and trying to build decent institutions. Yeah, it was actually a major bastion of progressivism in the early 20th century. They implemented a lot of significant reforms as part of that wave back in the day. So they've generally been less prone to the kind of caudillo strongman politics that are prevalent in, say, Brazil and Argentina. They've actually been kind of more disciplined in trying to maintain and build strong political institutions. And so correspondingly, their economy and politics over the past 100-some years have actually been pretty decent. Still a developing country. They've never really been quite able to break through to developed status, but that's not because their politics are chaotic. They've actually got that down pretty well, relatively speaking. It's not to say they haven't had their problems. In the 70s, they had an authoritarian government that disappeared large numbers of dissidents, killed a bunch of people. It's part of a broader crackdown in the southern cone of South America against leftist dissent that happened in the 70s, kind of overlapped with Operation Condor and CIA involvement in the region. But it didn't last as long in, say, Brazil or Argentina. I think in Uruguay's case, it was just a couple of years, whereas with Brazil, it was like 20 years. In Argentina, but I want to say like 10, something like that. Also, the circumstances of Uruguay's military junta coming to power were weird. Because with Brazil, it was a military coup. And I think in Argentina's case, it was also a coup, although it was kind of a soft popular coup, a little more complicated there. But with Uruguay, there was no coup. Rather, there was a government that was bipartisan. And as part of a bipartisan decision, that government decided to give authoritarian control of the country to the military for a limited period of time to deal with a perceived crisis. So instead of the military just overthrowing the government, they were just kind of given the keys to the kingdom. And then the government just kind of took a back seat for a while. Very weird stuff. Like, I don't think anybody else in Latin America did it like that. And from what I remember, Uruguay's military junta, it wasn't around for as long, but it was known for being more extreme than the others in the region. Interestingly, they tended to go a lot harder on the people they arrested. Like in other places, like, Pinochet's Chile, for example, in Argentina, they disappear you, torture you, kill you, etc. Kind of, if you're familiar with the topic, then that's pretty normal. It may sound extreme, and it was, but if you're familiar with the topic, you've definitely read about it before. It's exactly what you would expect. But in Uruguay, it was a little bit different. There was torture, killings, etc. But they tended to lean into the torture more, and they tended to be pretty creative about it. They preferred psychological torture. So what they would do is they would lock you in, say, mental asylums for long periods of time. And when I say put you in an asylum, I don't mean like a prison. I mean like full isolation. They didn't let you interact with anybody unless it was security personnel who were trying to interrogate or torture you. One of the recent presidents of Uruguay was a left-wing progressive guy who actually suffered that. He was a dissident activist who was arrested and disappeared for a number of years and wasn't released until near the end of the junta. And he was able to kind of become popular on account of that and eventually become president like 40 years later or whatever it was.
Interesting. I didn't know about that. Isolation torture. Yeah, it's definitely something that's scarring for humans, but you don't think about it as being that directly punishing because it doesn't hurt immediately. But it starves you of just your basic mental needs as a social animal. So the mind kind of struggles to keep its understanding of reality and morale.
Yeah, I think after the junta was gone, Uruguay kind of returned to normal relatively quickly. And they've just kind of been quiet ever since. Again, you just very rarely hear about them. Yeah, given their history before the junta, you would not have thought that they would be likely to experience that. You'd think if anybody in Latin America would have been able to avoid a violent military junta, it would be Uruguay. But now they just kind of slid into it, kind of almost casually, much less dramatically so than in their neighbors. And I have no idea what the fuck is happening in Paraguay. I don't think anybody does. They're never in the news. I could probably count the number of times I've seen them in international news on one hand. It's just one of those countries nobody ever hears about. Just too small, too poor, too isolated. So it just ends up on the back burner of history. Which is probably for the best. Countries that make the news generally aren't in the news for good reasons. Generally, one great power or another doesn't do nice things to you as a result of whatever it was that got you into the news. So probably not a bad thing to have a low profile. I guess there's Suriname too, but is anybody all that interested in Suriname?
Where is that again?
So it's east of Guyana, west of French Guinea, north of Brazil. It's on the northeastern coast of South America. It's not quite part of the Amazon. I think maybe the southern reaches of it kind of overlap with the Amazon rainforest. But it is heavily forested, and it has a very small population. I don't think it's even 1 million people. And as I recall, it was originally a Dutch colony. And so as a result, Dutch remains a major language of government, education, etc. I don't think they got their independence until 1975, I want to say. Something in that area, something in that time period. And the population is sort of a mix of Africans, people of African descent who have been imported to be slaves. There's a significant native population, more in the south, sort of in the interior. And then I think there's like a small Dutch minority that's still there. I think Creoles are technically the biggest portion of the population. That's sort of like a mix of all groups that have been there. Yeah, Suriname is definitely another one of those countries you rarely hear about. It's a little closer to the United States, so I think they've come up a little more often, but yeah, it's still not much. And unlike Guyana, I don't think they've ever had like a big find for natural resources, at least none that I'm aware of. So they just kind of remain a very, very poor backwater. Honestly, you could almost consider all three territories, French Guinea, Guyana, and Suriname, as effectively part of the Caribbean. Obviously, they're not islands, but in terms of their geography, like being tropical, and in terms of their populations, demographics, and culture, they've actually got a lot in common with the Caribbean. So you can kind of think of that region as kind of being a part of a greater Caribbean, so to speak. And most of the population density is on the coast anyway. So there's definitely historical ties between the coastal part of northern South America and the Caribbean. They have historically been economically, if not also politically, intertwined. And also the same political economies historically. You know, the Caribbean was sugar plantations for the most part. The northern part of South America, specifically the region I'm talking about here, the Guineas, they also had political economies dominated by sugar plantations in the early modern period of history. And they've also struggled with the legacy of that political economy, like everybody else who's had it has. French Guinea would probably be in the same boat, but it's part of France, so they get a lot more government money. Have you heard of French Guinea before?
Yeah, isn't that where Godzilla was made?
Was it? Oh, you mean
so.
like the 98 Godzilla?
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, now that you mention it, I think I do remember something about that. Yeah, I think parts of it were filmed there. But that's not really what it's known for.
Okay.
Well, having one of the worst Godzilla movies filmed at a location, that's not really something anybody should be proud of.
Well, I liked the movie when I was a kid, so.
I don't blame you. I thought it was an entertaining film as well, but if you're a lifetime Godzilla fan, you're going to have certain feelings about the TriStar 98 Godzilla movie. And I won't bore you by litigating it here on our world discussion segment, but that is a whole conversation unto itself.
That's fair. Some
But
people
yeah,
might
French
say,
Guinea.
some people
Sorry,
might
what?
say Godzilla snobs aren't a real thing. Meanwhile, Agent Smith, he's like, that's not my Godzilla.
You know how fan communities get. They're very
Yeah, for
particular
real.
about their IP.
I will say I am definitely someone who hooks on that kind of content of discussing different characters in media and like who would beat up who and stuff. I don't even subscribe to those subreddits, but it keeps serving me like, would Captain America be this person? It's like, I have to fucking know. Would he win? I don't know. I need to know. They have those
Well,
for, like,
look,
monsters like Godzilla too. Would Godzilla beat X, Y, or Z? And that's really what a lot of the shows and movies are about too. Is it pits him against other legendary types of monsters?
yes, but I won't litigate it. You're not going to tempt me into it.
Okay.
That is a whole thing. That is a whole. People of art. You have no idea how much people online argued about that.
There are
back in the
dozens of
day.
people mad right now in a Godzilla debate. Actively typing.
It's actually better now than it was back in the day. Now there's kind of an entente cordiale between the different factions, but yeah, it could get quite heated online back in the day when the movie came out, and in the 10 years after. It was a sore spot for a very long time for a great many people. But
Well, I would
French
guess it
Guinea-
probably. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I got baited back into it. That's fine. It is what it is. Okay.
So French Guinea, what it's really known for is the European Space Agency using it as a platform to launch rockets into space. That's actually a major center of the space industry. Many satellites that are fired up into orbit are actually fired up from French Guinea. So, French Guinea and I believe the Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan are like some of the main centers for that, as far as like commercial space industry. I think the Russians built a new space site in the Russian Far East. I forget what it's called. It's like Nakovny, something like that. And the United States, of course, has SpaceX and other sort of entities that are trying to compete in the same space that have sort of their own launch sites. I think Florida and Texas are some of the main ones. But yeah, because of that, because the French government invests so much in the European space industry in French Guinea's economy and standard of living is much better than their neighbors, be it Guyana, Suriname, or the northern part of Brazil, even some of the provinces up in the northern Amazonian region. Now, that doesn't mean that the native population is necessarily doing great, because as you might imagine, like they're not really getting a lot of the really high-paying jobs in the space industry. Generally, they're getting sort of the low-paying service sector jobs that are providing various goods and services to the people who work in the space industry, who migrate from abroad to work there. So there are still complaints from the native population that they're not really getting their fair share of economic development that's happening from space launches and other, related activities.
Mm-hmm. How come we don't get any space launches? We've got such a good launching area.
They vote in French elections.
Do they?
Yeah,
It
it's
counts
not
a
like
state
Puerto
or
Rico.
province?
Yeah, it is actually a province. Yeah, it's not like Puerto Rico where they kind of have their own thing going on. It is an integral part of France, so they treat it like any other French province. So correspondingly, they vote in French elections, have representation in the French legislature, etc. So they are fully fledged French citizens, and actually they are part of the European Union.
Oh.
So the European Union actually does technically have a toehold in the Americas in the form of French Guinea.
Interesting. Do they use euros as their currency?
They do.
Oh. Didn't know that. Yeah, so they wouldn't have like gotten in separately. It would have been because you are a part of France, you therefore are a EU location.
Sorry, what was that?
Because they are a part of France, they are an EU member, not because of their own kind of application process.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like their Hawaii. You can kind of think of it like that. Hawaii is a fully fledged state. Senators, House of Representatives in the House of Representatives, etc. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, French Guinea has representatives and whatnot, and is correspondingly a part of every international group that France is part of. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the same thing goes for other French overseas territories. So like French Polynesia, for example, Wallis and Futuna, I think, is another one. I think they've got some funky ones in the Indian Ocean, too, that people hardly ever hear about. I don't remember their names off the top of my head. But everybody in those places, they are like French citizens, access to the European Union, part of the European Union, and vote in French elections, the whole shebang.
Cool. Today we learned.
Okay, so do you really want to hear about 98 Godzilla?
Yes. Why is it
Yes,
not
you do. All right, so here's the problem, right? For one, it's basically just a Roland Emmerich action movie that is masquerading as a Godzilla film. So yes, it is entertaining in its own way. It's not a bad movie. It's not the worst movie. But is it really a Godzilla movie? So the argument goes, this is the traditional criticism, is that it's really not. You could have called the monster in that movie anything. It didn't have to be Godzilla. It just deviated so much from the norms, the established patterns of the Godzilla franchise, in terms of, say, the look of Godzilla, as well as the main themes, as well as the characters, the story, etc., that it just doesn't feel anything like a traditional Godzilla movie. And so it's really its own thing. It's basically just it's kind of like Starship Troopers. If you've read the book, you know that the movie isn't anything like it. It's basically just an action movie that has the Starship Troopers label on it. So in the same way, the 98 Godzilla movie is just a generic monster movie with a Godzilla label on it.
I see.
So that's kind of where the hate came from, because they didn't broadcast that, right? They didn't advertise it as that. They said this is an American Godzilla movie. And so the fan base got really excited for that, because that had never happened before. And they didn't really have ready access at that time to a lot of the Japanese Godzilla movies that were coming out in the 90s. There was kind of a delay before they were released on home video in the US market. So people were looking forward to it, and then they watch it and they kind of felt a little cheated. A lot of people did, anyway. Enough that it turned into a big civil war online. They felt like there had been some degree of false advertising going on. So it's not a bad movie per se. It's just not a Godzilla movie. Hence the criticism.
I got you. That makes sense. I didn't really know of Godzilla at the time that it came out. I think that was maybe my first introduction to it. There might have been a cartoon Godzilla that I had seen as well. I think
the Hanna-Barbera cartoon Godzilla?
Yes, I think so.
Well, actually, there was another one that was actually an adaptation of the 98 Godzilla movie. It could have been that, too. I think that ran for a couple seasons, but the Hanna-Barbera one was the main one before that. That was the one with Godzuki?
Yes.
Like that weird... Okay, yeah, Hanna-Barbera, definitely then. Yeah, that was an acid trip of a show. For those of you I hate to bore people with this during the world discussion segment, but you know, when somebody talks about the thing that you're stupid about, then you kind of have to. So I'm stupid about this. If you're interested in acid trip style Godzilla content, Toho's YouTube channel has been celebrating, what is it, like the 50th or whatever anniversary of the Godzilla franchise. And they've just kind of been dicking around with it. They've just been letting people post shit, basically. They've got this, and it's actually been long running now. Actually, the anniversary was like a couple years ago, I guess. But they have a series of shorts that they've been releasing as part of it, and it is extremely fucking goofy. So if you like campy Godzilla content, definitely check out their YouTube channel. They've got a bunch of shit there. I think they also had like a children's show. It was like a Godzilla cartoon children's show. They've been releasing it on YouTube as well. And it's bizarre. When I say bizarre, I say it's bizarre because they've been letting the English translators just kind of dick around with the translation. So some of it is a little inadvertently funny. Again, Toho just decided to run with it. They're just kind of having fun at this point. So if you like that kind of stuff, give that a try. For you, like, handful of Godzilla fans who might be listening to this. Anyway, all very important stuff to international affairs. Integral knowledge for the understanding of any and all major strategic decisions happening all over the world. Anyway, Godzilla tangents aside, what did you want to get to next?
How's the U.S. doing after the assassination and stuff? Have we simmered down, or is that still a meme for a lot of people?
It's kind of still kicking around. It's going to be a talking point pretty much indefinitely, especially, you know, in elections and whatnot. But for the moment, the zeitgeist seems to be shifting to the next thing. Attention spans are very short in this era. So people always have new outrages they want to fixate on. The Trump administration was making noise about trying to crack down on radicalization and extremism, basically political violence, as they put it. And so that had some people concerned about how exactly they were going to actually operationalize that into actual public policy. I think I did read an executive order that was posted on the White House's website that talked about how they might do that. I think I had that in the highlight reel somewhere. Yeah. So it had a couple of things that it talked about, which may or may not be significant. With the Trump administration, they like to talk tough, but they rarely follow through. So this could just be more cheap talk. But there is sort of some legal groundwork being laid here for a broader crackdown on dissent, if that is something they want to do. And so that has some people particularly concerned. So the executive order, I think I had 3 things from the executive order that I kind of homed in on. Let's see. 1, quote, politically motivated terrorist attacks such as organized doxing campaigns, swatting, rioting, looting, trespass, assault, destruction of property, threats of violence, and civil disorder, end quote. So these are all things that it's defining as terrorist acts, politically motivated terrorist acts. And that's a very broad definition, which is always, it should always be disconcerting for everybody when a government starts talking about things like terrorism with broad definitions, because that's generally a sign they want to do something that they should not be doing. So that was the first red flag for me. And this should not be controversial to anybody who lived through the war on terror at its height back in the aughts, because this is the kind of thing people were concerned about the government doing then. And this is still not quite crossing the red line, but again, it sets the legal foundation for it if they want to pursue this further. So that was red flag number 1. Second red flag, so this is also a quote, all federal law enforcement agencies with investigative authority shall question and interrogate within all lawful authorities individuals engaged in political violence or lawlessness regarding the entity or individual organizing such actions and any related financial sponsorship of these actions. Now that's the kind of thing that you would expect investigative authorities to do kind of regardless. But the concern here is that the government may pressure investigators to find something even if there's not something there to be found, so that they can use that as legal ammunition in order to crack down on dissent, especially more organized expressions of dissent like NGOs. And then red flag number 3, quote, in the course of and as a result of the investigations directed by Section 2 of this memorandum, the Attorney General may recommend that any group or entity whose members are engaged in activities meeting the definition of, quote, domestic terrorism, end quote, in 18 U.S.C. 23315 merits designation as a, quote, domestic terrorist organization, end quote. So that's another broad ambit to paint kind of whomever as terrorists, if they want. Because again, if you have a broad definition of domestic terrorism, and you can be broadly defined as some kind of group, then this would suggest then that that group, whatever it is, be it an NGO or a circle of friends or whomever, can be designated a domestic terrorist organization and have the national security apparatus directed against you correspondingly.
Yeah, you just update the definition to terrorism is violent acts of asymmetric warfare that make people very upset and also people I don't like.
Yeah, that's the concern. So this is not like a fully fledged move in that direction, but this is the kind of first step towards that. Mm-hmm. So it's a negative signal and a red flag overall for that reason. So yet another thing to keep your eye on. We'll see where the government goes with this. In all likelihood, this just kind of goes away after a while, and it doesn't end up being a thing. But a lot of people were paranoid about this happening, and now step 1 is happening. So even though I think nothing will happen of it, I think the significance of that is that the more times that the government moves in that direction or signals that it has an interest in it, even if it doesn't actually have an interest or an intention in doing it, that does increase political tension and partisanship. And given how tense that environment already is, I don't think that's a healthy thing to do. There's already a mild uptick in political violence. I don't really see how this is going to help with that. Unless we are going to go just like full 70s Latin America, in which case we're going to have a whole different set of problems and topics to talk about on here. I did have a correction for you.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, you were right about East Timor. So the native name is Timor-Leste, and you were asking if Leste was Portuguese for East. And I thought it was the native language, not Portuguese, but you were right. Actually, it is Portuguese.
Okay.
So Timor-Leste is Portuguese for East Timor. Good call.
Yeah, I was thinking about it today, just the reason that it's called Latin America and not Spanish America is because Brazil is a really big country down there. There's maybe other countries that speak Portuguese, or is it just Brazil?
It depends on how you want to define speak Brazil. Because if you mean official language, then there's a litany of countries that have Portuguese, that speak Portuguese, quote unquote. But if you want to define speak Portuguese as like the native population, huh?
Yeah, their primary language.
Yeah. The primary language. Then it's a short list. Yeah, then it's Portugal, Brazil, And I think that's probably about it. Just the two. Yeah, I think it's just the two as far as like the general population speaking it. Now, if you want to define it more broadly, as in Portuguese is unofficial language, then you can include Portugal's former colonies overseas. Generally, they still retain Portuguese as an official language. So Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau. I don't think Macau still has it as an official language. I think Macau's official language, after it was handed over to China, was obviously Mandarin for one, but then I think the other official language was like the native language, which was a mix of Portuguese and Cantonese, I think. But I don't think they retained actual Portuguese as an official language. Actually, I'm not sure about East Timor.
How would you take control of a country that, or a place that far away like Macau, if you're Portugal?
In the case of Macau, so in the case of Macau, it was by negotiation. They did not conquer it. There was no way they were going to be able to beat the Chinese army, like in the 1600s with the resources they had available. You know, like you say, it was just too far away. In India, they could kind of get more leverage by the fact that they could disrupt major trade flows, because there were some major maritime trade arteries that ran from southern India to the Middle East. And because nobody could beat the Portuguese in naval combat, they could basically sit on those sea lanes and engage in unstoppable piracy and make it impossible for normal trade to happen. So that gave them enough leverage to cut some deals with local elites in the region. They could not do that with China because the Chinese government didn't really give a shit about foreign trade. And so in order to get Macau, basically the Portuguese just went to the Chinese and asked very politely if they could have a little trading post in southern China. And they conceded to do that, basically in exchange for money. Not like a lump sum per se, but you know, China retained sovereignty over the territory and was able to tax it and make money from the trade between southern China and the West, broadly speaking, since effectively that's what the Portuguese were doing. They would buy stuff in Macau, you know, Chinese goods, and then sell them back to Europe.
Just as
so they did not conquer it.
A note here, unstoppable piracy is a really cool designation, and I think there is room to do a spin-off Pirates of the Caribbean with some of the unstoppable British pirates who influenced the kind of control of India.
Yeah, you're well, I don't know how many British or English pirates there were afflicting the Indian Ocean. I think that was more of a Caribbean thing. And they were pretty stoppable in the Caribbean. They were, even if they were, you know, they could be quite strong and engaged in a lot of raiding, they were still quite afraid of the Spanish Navy, which was very, very powerful. It was very rare, for example, for pirates of any kind to raid the treasure fleets that carried the gold from Peru and Mexico to Spain, because the treasure fleets were so heavily armed. It did happen on rare occasions, but generally the fleet got the better of that. Pirates didn't generally do so well in those cases. There was piracy in the Indian Ocean, but I think it was mostly Portuguese. I think by the time the English and the Dutch got there, well, the English and Dutch just weren't that interested in piracy in the East. They were more interested in actual trade. I think we talked before about how like the English and the Dutch were more merchants and the Portuguese were more like conquistadors, effectively, in the region. Mm-hmm. They did engage in some trade, but they also did a lot of extortion. A not insignificant amount of piracy. But you're right, in either case, like in both the Dutch, English, and Portuguese cases, their navies were pretty much unstoppable. So when they did engage in conflict, be it piracy or just general conflict among themselves or with native kingdoms, they were generally pretty unstoppable. They just the natives very rarely were able to put to sea a flotilla or a fleet that was able to really contest successfully the seas being dominated by one or the other European power. So if that's what you mean by unstoppable piracy, then yes, agreed.
Yeah, the marine edge is one that's interesting historically and giving you a lot of leverage regionally. If you have the superior navy or ability to traverse the waterways, then you have mobility advantage. You also have like a easy retreat option from a lot of operations and stuff, even if you can't like surmount their entire conventional military. The hit and run advantage of having like a really good sea presence is powerful.
Apparently Portuguese is one of the official languages of East Timor, so you can add that one to the list.
Cool.
I think that's all of them though. Have you ever heard of Guinea-Bissau?
Doesn't really ring a bell.
That's a small West African country. It started, well, I should say the Portuguese colony in Guinea-Bissau started out as just a trading post that Portuguese explorers set up there in the, I want to say the early mid-1500s. And, you know, the Portuguese set up a lot of trading posts on the west coast of Africa while they were trying to find a way to get to the Indian Ocean. So it wasn't all that unusual in the grand scheme of things. The only unusual thing about Guinea-Bissau is that it was one of the few such outposts that the Portuguese ended up keeping over the long term, because most of their other colonies ended up getting taken from them either by native kingdoms or by rival European powers that forced them to cede them. But there were a couple of territories they were able to hang on to up until the 1970s, and Guinea-Bissau was one of them. I don't think it was ever an especially valuable territory, which probably is one of the reasons they were able to hang on to it and nobody else really wanted it that much. It was pretty much very poor, and out of all the Portuguese territories they controlled until the 70s, I believe was kind of a backwater. It was not like a big priority to hang on to it. But eventually, the people there, like people in much of Africa in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they decided they wanted independence. You know, they developed their own nationalist movement. And so there was increasing agitation amongst activists against the Portuguese colonial authorities, which eventually broke out into outright violence and conflict, I think in the early mid-70s. And that happened to coincide with the Carnatic? What was it called? Basically, it was the revolution that overthrew the vestiges of the Salazar regime and paved the way for democratic Portugal. It's kind of something. It's going to bug me. Carnation Revolution. There we go. Yeah, that would have been 1970 something. Let me see, 74, according to Wikipedia. So, you know, the revolution in Guinea-Bissau kind of corresponded with that, and so that was fortunate because once the government collapsed and the new authorities came to power, they were much less interested in maintaining the Portuguese empire. The authoritarian government was very conservative and was very much wedded to the idea of a greater Portugal that encompassed all of their overseas territories, but the new democratic government didn't give a shit. And so it wasn't too long after that Portuguese overseas territories were granted independence. So Guinea-Bissau was one of them. You know, the violence was brought to an end via ceasefire and negotiation, which ended in Guinea-Bissau's independence, and it's been independent ever since. Of course, the problem is that it was never especially developed to begin with, and so when it did become independent, it kind of just became dysfunctional. Just another poor, impoverished West African state that didn't really have a strong economic backbone to kind of carry it into the future. So I think the main economic driver of Guinea-Bissau's economy today is actually drug trafficking. Because the government is so dysfunctional and lacks rule of law, it's an attractive locale for drug runners of one kind or another to move product, basically, through the territory, take advantage of the lack of policing, or perhaps more accurately, the bribability and corruption of the authorities. So a good chunk of the drugs that people consume in Europe actually move through Guinea-Bissau as a result.
Where do the Europeans get their drugs from? Because we get ours from, what, South America?
Yeah, most of the poppy plants that make for the base ingredient to the cocaine and whatnot that we consume here comes from Bolivia. I think there's some made in like other parts of the Andes, maybe parts of Peru, Colombia, but as I understand it, Bolivia is like the main producer of the coca core ingredient. For Europe, I think most of it comes from Afghanistan, or at least it did anyway before the Taliban came back. I'm not sure what the Taliban's approach to drugs has been. Back when they were in power the last time in the 90s, they took a very hard line on drugs and eradicated a good chunk of the poppy plants in the country. And then after they were ousted and when the occupation began, or when it was liberated, depending on your perspective, the subsequent democratic Afghanistan saw a pretty significant resurgence of poppy production. Although a lot of that resurgence actually had to do with the Taliban themselves, since they actually were able to tax that production and sale. Well, tax the sale of the poppy plants being produced and use it to fund their war effort, which they were quite happy to do because they needed the money pretty badly. So once the government collapsed and the Taliban came back to power, intuitively you would think that they would crack down again on poppy production, but I haven't actually read that they've done that anywhere, so I don't know if that's true. Certainly a number of the warlords that cut deals with the Taliban as the government was collapsing probably would have asked, maybe demanded, that the Taliban respect their drug fiefdoms, since a lot of pro-government warlords back in the day made their fortunes off of, poppy production and drug running of one kind or another. And so given that their fortunes were tied up in it, it makes sense that a deal with the Taliban might involve some exemptions, so to speak, for their particular territories so that they could continue making money in their traditional fashion.
Yeah, it's hard for people to refuse money. There's a bit of a, expansion on the point for where the drugs come from. Poppy plants make heroin, and coca leaves make cocaine.
Ah, thank you. Okay.
The chat's also saying that the coca leaf is something that people in Bolivia are allowed to grow for themselves because they make a tea out of it that helps with altitude sickness.
Yeah, cultural reasons. I remember it's because I specifically remember decades ago, Condoleezza Rice, she was a high-ranking official in the Bush administration at the time. She actually went to Bolivia on an official state visit. And the president of Bolivia, I think it was Evo Morales at the time, gave her a garland of coca. Which was quite the sight, given that part of the reason she was there was to try to pressure the government into stopping the production of coca, which the government didn't want to do because they wanted to allow people to do it for cultural reasons. Mm-hmm. So she comes to tell them to stop, and he gives them a full-on fucking garland of coca leaves. I found it quite amusing at the time, anyway. Mm-hmm. Okay, so cocaine for American consumption, that's Bolivia. Heroin for European production, sourced from poppy plants in Afghanistan. I'm not sure where Europeans would get their cocaine then. I guess it could be that they get it from the same source. Because I think I have read about smuggling of cocaine from South America to Europe. And that would actually make sense for Guinea-Bissau, because that's kind of between Brazil, well, South America broadly, and Europe. So that would make it a logical choice for a stopover point. So then where do Americans get our heroin? Inquiring minds want to know. I guess we could import it from Afghanistan too, but that's awful far away. And I feel like you could probably grow it in South America, could you not?
Probably.
Not sure.
I don't know the botany of the plant. Yeah, both of
feel
those
like
are
whenever-
the opiate class of drug, which acts on the pain and pleasure pathway, and it makes it, I think, the most or among the most addictive of all drugs. So, kind of learning about them, the opiate class is expensive, addictive, and you can overdose on it. So it's pretty sus in terms of personal safety. I would not advise messing with opiates. Advise against. That's my take.
Yeah, they're pretty dangerous. It's best not to mess with them too much. I think that had been the most dangerous class of drugs until some of the synthetic stuff started coming out around 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. People are saying fentanyl has mostly displaced heroin in the U.S. Huh.
Gotcha.
I would guess that's more plentiful because it's synthetic and probably made nearby, or it can be made anywhere.
It's not generally made nearby. As I understand it, most of it is manufactured in China.
Huh.
And then it's exported abroad from there. That has to do with basically lack of rule of law, making it difficult to police it in China. But also the barrier to entry into manufacturing synthetic opioids is relatively high compared to traditional forms of drugs that are not synthetic. And China has relatively high human capital. So between having good human capital and weak rule of law, it's a relatively ideal choice for manufacturing synthetic drugs of one kind or another. That's my understanding anyway. Now, I have read that because of crackdowns over the past 5 to 10 years, some organized criminal groups in China have started moving production of synthetic drugs outside of China. I think Mexico has been one locale they've set up in. But I think most of the production remains in China as of now, at least last I checked.
Chat's saying that
maybe that's
fentanyl is more addictive than heroin. Crazy.
Yeah, I believe that's what they do with the. I'm not a chemist, so I'm not the best guy to ask, but I believe that's the whole point of the synthetic process. They introduce elements that make it stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe somebody in chat can clear that aspect up. Yeah, that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm obviously not an expert in a lot of the things I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback we get on here. I can't find Condoleezza Rice's picture with the garland of coca leaves. Very sad. Maybe it wasn't Rice. Maybe it was somebody else. Thought it was her. She was Secretary of State in the Bush administration for a long time. So I kind of assumed it would be somebody like, but she later on became Secretary of Defense? not remembering it well. She was the former sex state. Okay, so later on she was sex state. And then before that, she must have been like a national security advisor.
What's a sex state?
Secretary of State.
Oh.
Are you familiar with Condoleezza Rice? She's actually pretty interesting.
Not really.
So she actually trained as a Sovietologist in the 1980s when she was in grad school. So basically specializing in international affairs with a focus on the Soviet Union. So she studied their politics, their economy, demographics, like everything. She was a Soviet specialist. And that was her entry point into the national security world, which she was then able to leverage into appointments into national security positions in Republican administrations. And so the culmination of her career was the second, I should say, Bush Jr.'s administration, and more specifically in his second term, which I believe is when she was promoted to Secretary of State finally. Yeah, when she was growing up, she was a child in, I want to say, Alabama. She actually survived a church bombing back in the 1960s. This was at the height of like racial tension surrounding the passage of the Civil Rights Act and activism stemming from Northerners moving to the South to try to promote voting amongst Black communities in the South. So there was a lot of political violence at that time in which activists and also just regular members of the African American community in the South were targeted. And when she was a child, she was at a church when it was bombed, and she actually kind of witnessed that firsthand.
She survived it, I assume.
Oh yeah. I think she was there with a friend or something when it happened. But yeah, she survived and moved up the ranks, became Secretary of State. Yeah, of the people serving in the Bush Jr. administration, she was probably one of the smarter ones, if not the smartest one. She was probably partly, if not fully, responsible for the pivot between the foreign policy of the first term Bush Jr. administration and the administration's second term. Very, very aggressive in the first term, but second term, they cooled off pretty considerably. Condoleezza Rice was a part of that transition.
Today we learned.
How are we doing on time?
Been going for an hour and a half.
Gotcha. Well, let's see. It was a little bit of, well, the usual suspects. We can always just kind of go through the regulars, Israel, Ukraine, trade.
Sure.
Oh, did you see there was before we do that, did you see the shooting in Dallas?
No. What about it?
So there was a ICE detention facility. ICE is immigration and customs enforcement. So they had a facility in Dallas and somebody shot at it. So that was in the news for a while. It's only been like a couple weeks since the Kirk assassination. So anything that seems like left-wing political violence is kind of getting into the news very easily now. So this seemed to qualify. I don't think all of the details have come out about it yet, but it looks like another example of left-wing political violence. But again, we're kind of waiting to hear all the details. It was a pretty dumb effort because the guy, from what we know, seemed to be targeting ICE. But of the people he shot, he did shoot a couple ICE personnel, but none of them died. The only person who died was a detainee, an immigrant that was being detained there. So he wanted to send a message, I guess, to ICE, but then only succeeded in killing an ICE detainee. And then after the shooting, he just shot himself. So that was it.
Damn.
As far as politically motivated shootings go, that's 1 out of 10 stars. I don't know what he hoped to accomplish, but very poor effort. Yeah, as is usually the case with... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You can finish the story, but we did have some questions this week.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll get to that. But as is usually the case with these, my initial assumption is pretty much always and forever that these people are some kind of crazy or mentally unstable. That seems to be a common through line. The Kirk assassin is an interesting and strange aberration from that trend. He seems relatively well-adjusted from what we know about him thus far. So it's going to be interesting to see a more thorough profile of him later on when it emerges. But this guy, this seems more like a traditional, like, stupid, crazy guy shooting. Just shoots himself in the foot, fails to do what he sets out to do, and then just kind of kills himself. We'll see. But I don't think this one is going to be nearly as politically charged as, say, the Kirk thing. Okay, so questions. Okay. What is the upside for the U.S. for doing this currency exchange with Argentina? Is it just to back Malay's administration? Near as I can tell, yes. That seems to be exactly why they're doing that. There's a lot of governments around the world that are under financial stress, but they don't seem to get the same special attention from the Trump administration. So I have to assume Trump is doing this as some kind of favor for Malay. Now, just why he's so interested in it, again, I don't know. They're not, as I said before, they're not really politically aligned on a lot of things. So I'm not sure what Trump thinks he's accomplishing here, but I suspect, again, that it's just down to personal relationship. He likes the guy and wants to help him out. The quid pro quo for that, unclear as of now, but I'm sure we'll find out in time. Let's see, it's the swap happening right now? Because as far as I heard, they're going to make a deal after the October elections, so it might not happen. I haven't heard the details on the timing of it. I only read that they had agreed on a currency swap. It may be that the announcement of the agreement itself was intended to try to mollify markets and try to stem the pressure on the Argentine government's finances. But if that's the case, it didn't work. So I assume that they would be able to set up a swap agreement in relatively short order. So I don't think they would necessarily have to wait a whole, say, week or month or whatever to do it. And given the Trump administration's cavalier approach to, laws and restrictions, they could just do it regardless of the legal restrictions on their doing so. So it seems like if they really wanted to just do the currency swap now, they could just make that happen. I don't know what point there would be in just having it done after the October elections. Presumably, if Trump is going to go to bat for Malay and help him out, he would want to do it as soon as possible before the election so that the economy has time to stabilize and so that Malay and his party will look relatively good and presumably will then have a more favorable outcome in the elections. But again, I haven't heard details on just what the timing is, so, maybe you're right. Maybe they are going to have to delay it until afterwards, in which case it's going to be too late to really matter politically. And given that the whole impetus for market pressure right now is specifically because of the Buenos Aires election, I would think that there's even more impetus then to try to have assistance happen before the October election. Because if they don't, then there's every reason to believe the October general election could be even more damaging than the Buenos Aires election, in which case Argentina is going to be in even more of a hole, economically speaking, in terms of international market pressure. And also any hope or confidence that Malay's reforms will last will be gone if the opposition picks up enough seats in the legislature in the October elections. So, all of those are reasons why the swap should, strategically speaking, happen before October. And I assume that they'll try to make that work. But we'll see. We shall see. Let's see. Is there any word on the number of refugees coming out of Portland? How many of the Antifa soldiers have a mat? Have you heard about this, Neuro?
No.
So this past week, the Trump administration, specifically Trump himself, announced that he's going to send the military to Portland because apparently the city is just in shambles and is in dire need of federal assistance.
Is it really? I don't know.
It is not. It is very much not, as the internet has been joking for much of the past week. You can think of this as being in the same vein of the administration sending troops into Washington or threatening to send troops to Chicago. Basically, it's just more of the same. Just more idle threats from the president in order to look tough. Let's see. Have you heard about the Chinese-born O2 glue to fix fractures in minutes? I have not. A bone O2 glue. No, first I've heard of it. But I will look it up later, because that does sound interesting. Huh. Oh, it's for bones. Okay, that's what you meant by bone glue. Okay. Yeah, China is quite capable of innovation. It's just inhibited by the overarching political economy, which is not really structured to favor independent economic initiative. If you're the beneficiary of some industrial policy initiative on the part of the government, then you can be awash in money and do pretty well. But those tens of policies tend to be very narrowly focused on very specific goods. And so most people do not benefit, and as a result end up starved of capital as money gets redirected to industrial policy priorities. So they're more than capable, they just don't have a favorable financial environment to work in. So I would guess that this is kind of a product of the limited innovation sector within China. Although I guess they have been focusing on biotech. That is technically one of the priorities. When I think of Chinese industrial policy, normally I think of electric vehicles, clean energy, solar panels, stuff like that. Batteries, another big one. But biotechnology is actually a priority unto itself. Semiconductors, another one, computer chips, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, that's another aspect. But biotech kind of gets short shrift. In terms of attention, in terms of money, they get a shit ton of government money. But when you read about Chinese industrial policy or trade tension with the United States, biotech doesn't tend to come up as much.
What is biotech, just for the technical classification?
So it's kind of similar to pharmaceuticals, but biotech has more to do with directly modifying the body or exploiting organic, the product of organic processes. If you think about, what was it called? Insulin. Insulin was reclassified as a biotic, which is basically biotech, because it's technically produced from organic matter rather than in a lab. It's not an artificial process like it is with a lot of chemicals or pharmaceuticals, rather. So I can't remember exactly what the organic process is. Somebody in chat probably remembers off the top. I'm probably totally mischaracterizing it, but roughly the idea is it's a byproduct of a natural organic material that produces it organically. And so that in turn is a form of biotechnology because you're using natural material to produce something. Alternatively, it can also just mean growing organs, for example. I think that technically qualifies as biotechnology. I'm not super familiar with all of the newest tech there, so I can't really run down a list of good examples. But basically, it has to do with medical technology relating to organic matter, either the human body itself or organic matter that can be used to produce products that can then be processed or used directly as some kind of medicine. It's a distinct category from pharmaceuticals or just medical technology more broadly. And it is cutting edge technology. There's a lot of advancements that have been made in recent decades in terms of genetics, for example, and that's allowed much better and more targeted, specific projects to develop treatments for this, that, or the other malady. I guess would genetic engineering be a form of biotechnology? I guess it would.
No, sounds.
Have you heard of CRISPR?
Yes, vaguely.
Yeah. So I think technically that would qualify as biotech as well. Yeah, there's not any one specific technology that you can use and say, hey, that's biotechnology. There's a kind of range of different technologies that are being developed under the rubric of biotech. And basically the one thing they have in common is that they're taking advantage of scientific and technological innovation that's happened within the past 10 to 20 years.
I see.
Yeah, it's considered important because, healthcare developments can be very, well, they're always going to be in high demand because there's always going to be people who have one malady or another. So whoever develops the next cutting edge medical technology, especially one that can address a problem that afflicts large portions of the population, that company or country is going to make a lot of money and will have leverage over every other country that wants it and has to import it from them. Mm-hmm. So strategists maybe strategist isn't the right word, national security personnel in the United States government, let's say, are concerned about the implications of being dependent on China for the import of potentially critical high-demand medical technology that could be developed in China's biotech field in the future. And so as a result, they have identified biotech as a strategic critical sector that the US government needs to support in order to ensure that it can compete and hold its own against Chinese biotech developments. But yeah, it tends to, because it is kind of smaller in absolute terms, and the sexy industry is semiconductors and electric vehicles, clean energy, those tend to get all the attention. Mm-hmm. And so biotech gets crowded out in the Sino-American competition field, so to speak. Have you talked about Eric Adams resigning from the New York City mayoral election? How might that get Mamdani elected? I don't know if Mass Neotech is in here, but he would probably know better than I, because he actually lives there. Yeah, I have not talked about Eric Adams resigning, but I wasn't really planning to, because the mayoral election is kind of a local thing. Keep in mind, Mamdani was not born in the United States, so even if he does win the election, he's not going to be able to leverage that into broader political ambitions. Maybe the most he could hope for is Senate or House rep, but he can't ever really be president. So there's kind of an inherent inbuilt cap on what he can do. And given that he is relatively far left progressive, and the overall trajectory of American politics is not really leaning in that direction, I don't know that it's going to be all that meaningful in the grand scheme of things if he does win. So those are all just reasons I hadn't really been paying too much attention to it. But yes, Eric Adams, I believe the current sitting mayor, technically, has said that he's not going to run for re-election. And so he had been one of the two major opponents to Mamdani, the other one being Andrew Cuomo. And so the implication then is that because one of the two major opponents is gone, that actually makes it harder for Mamdani to win, because now the opposition vote will not be divided between Cuomo and Adams. Now it's going to all be focused into presumably Cuomo, and that will increase the probability of them successfully running against Mamdani. But he could still win. It may be that it's, even without Adams around, that the vote for Cuomo is not sufficient. New York City is very progressive, so you've got to think Mamdani has the inside track there. But as I've been informed by our resident New Yorker, New York has no shortage of people who are very much not progressive. So there will be demand for Cuomo in the upcoming election, including from people who are not necessarily sympathetic to Democrats, but don't want to vote for the Republican candidate because they think he has exactly zero chance of winning. Yeah, my understanding is that the Republican candidate for the mayor's office is not competitive, to put it mildly.
Mayor is one of those gigs that has a pretty broad difference in the intensity of the job for someone who's a mayor of New York City compared to some like local rural town mayor. I don't know how much more you can do, but it's a huge city.
Yeah, it's definitely a prestigious position. I don't want to downplay that, but I don't know what Mamdani can do with it if he gets it. As far as like what he wants to do after he's mayor. Normally what happens is people use mayoral positions as launch pads for political careers into higher offices of one kind or another. But I don't know if Mamdani is going to be able to do that. Do you remember Michael Bloomberg?
Yes.
He had been mayor of New York back in, what I want to say, the 90s or aughts, something like that. I guess it must have been the odds because Giuliani was mayor in the 90s. But Bloomberg was an independent. He was very, very wealthy independent. And what he did is he kind of used the mayoral office of New York City as a jumping off point for presidential ambitions. If I remember correctly, he did run for president after that. Giuliani also ran for president, but that did not go well for him.
Yeah, his political career has taken a bit of a nosedive, I think.
There's going to be a wild documentary made about him someday. That guy's career has done some serious careening. Okay. So, Israel. Not a whole lot to go through here, so I'll just kind of plow through it quickly. Donald Trump went on record this week to say he will not allow I've seen from probably any American president in some decades about the West Bank.
Your voice lagged out for a second. You said Trump said what? And then it cut out.
Trump said that he will not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. And that's as forceful a statement I've heard from an American president on that in many decades. Generally, presidents kind of prevaricate and say, well, we're not really comfortable with that. The official position of the United States government is that the border should be the green line and that both sides should negotiate with the green line as the basis for a potential future Palestinian state. But then they don't really follow through to actually pressure Israel to stop settlements in the West Bank, so it ends up being kind of meaningless. So the American position traditionally has been ambiguity. The Trump administration generally just outright favors Israel, but here seems to be taking a very explicit line against the prospect of annexing the West Bank. Now, my suspicion is that there's not going to be any follow-through here. There is some discontent in the administration, the Trump administration, about the Israeli government's war in Gaza and whatnot, but for the most part, they seem to be backing them and don't seem to have much appetite for actual confrontation. And the Israelis, and especially Netanyahu, have a long history of massaging political leadership in Washington that they don't like or that wants them to do something they don't want to do. So between the Trump administration's disinterest broadly and actually taking risks vis-a-vis issues like Ukraine or Israel-Palestine, they're disinterested in getting more involved, shall we say, and the Israeli government's proclivity in manipulating presidents. I would assume that nothing actually comes of this. I think if Israel does want to move towards annexation, probably they'll just do it and then offer it as a fait accompli, and Washington won't really want to actually do anything about it. So the ball is very much in Israel's court in that regard. Tony Blair, I don't know if you remember him, he's a former prime minister of the United Kingdom.
I do.
He's in talks to lead a potential transitional Gaza administration. So there's been talk about how do we get rid of Hamas's government in Gaza, and if we do get rid of it, what do we replace it with? So there's been a lot of hemming and hawing from Israel and the Arab neighboring states around Gaza about just how that would work. And nobody's really come up with a solution that everybody agrees on. And recently, there's been negotiation, although no real traction. No reason to be any more optimistic about this than any of the other proposals. But there is a recent negotiation over setting up an international regime in Gaza that is impartial. And possibly, if these reports are true, Tony Blair could potentially lead such an administration. Hypothetically, the administration would just be temporary until a new native authority or some alternative authority could be arranged. This is worth mentioning just because it shows that talks about the governance of Gaza post-Hamas are still being negotiated. But it's also almost not worth mentioning because really, I don't think the Israeli government actually cares that much about that. I think the Netanyahu administration is mostly concerned about going after Hamas, potentially getting rid of them, but I don't really know if that's even possible. And so I suspect then that the war is kind of its own self-perpetuating machine at this point. It's not really about dealing with Hamas or anything else. It's more just about punishing an enemy and potentially fulfilling some long-standing objectives held by the Israeli far right, depending on how far Netanyahu wants to go here. But I don't think all of this talk about a transitional government is really going to go anywhere. I strongly suspect this is just the Netanyahu government stringing other countries and leaders along in order to further delay any significant pushback on the elongation of the conflict.
Was Tony Blair the prime minister?
Recognized.
They were the prime minister
Tony
at the
Blair?
same time as, Tony Blair at the same time as George W. Bush?
Yes, there was overlap. Tony Blair was prime minister of the UK during the tail end of the Clinton administration's second term, and for the first term, I believe, of Bush Jr.'s administration.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Tony Blair got a lot of shit for going along with the Bush administration's war in Iraq. That basically destroyed his prime ministership. Yeah, he had been pretty popular before that. You know, he was sort of supposed to be this, almost like Bill Clinton. He was supposed to be kind of a moderate center-left figure who compromised between the traditional positions of the right and left in their respective polities. And he seemed to be fairly popular and to have a strong hold on power, but then Iraq happened and that was it for him. People really turned on him after that, especially on the left. I don't think people over there ever really forgave him for that either. He still gets shit for that to this day.
Interesting that they choose him for this then.
Well, it's not unusual for him to have... He's been kind of doing the rounds as an international statesman. You know, it's not unusual for retired politicians to do that, but Tony Blair in particular tends to pop up during these during the development of international institutions or during various international negotiations or initiatives that involve some kind of international component. I think he was, what was it? Facebook hired him to be some kind of advisor. I forget what exactly it was supposed to be about, but he was some kind of political advisor for Facebook in order to kind of help them navigate international pressure and laws regarding social media regulations. So, it's nothing especially consistent. He doesn't have like one cause he keeps harping on. He's just one of those retired statesmen who pops up periodically, consistently across time, just not consistently in any one place. So I wasn't really all that surprised to see him pop up here, as an elder statesman who could hypothetically be neutral. He's not necessarily a bad choice. It's just that it's not an uncontroversial choice, given his background involvement in the Iraq War.
Did that make him, I guess, more favorable to Americans then?
Not really. I mean, yes, in the sense that he was helping the United States. So there was affinity there. But at the same time, Americans never really cared that much about foreign leaders. So I don't know that his profile was really all that great. Like, if you had asked, like, the man on the street, even if he was pro-war, like pro-Iraq war, the casual man on the street would probably not be all that familiar with the leaders of America's allies in the conflict. Mm-hmm. Tony Blair was relatively high profile, so probably more people would have been familiar with him, but I don't think supporting the United States ever made him into like an icon in American politics, certainly not on the American right, given that Tony Blair himself was part of the British equivalent of the Democrats, a left-wing party.
Yeah, I guess that would make him relatively more disliked than if he were conservative or right-wing.
Yeah, people on the right just kind of expected American allies to fall into line and didn't especially respect leaders that did so. And then the American left hated him because he went along with the war. So it was not all that advantageous in terms of building his profile in the United States.
I see. But clearly still has a career in politics, so he's going.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always a role for elder statesmen if they want to stay involved in some capacity or another. Generally, it's a pretty trivial capacity, but they can get their name in the papers. Let's see, the next thing is that a number of states have officially recognized a Palestinian state. This is a big deal in so much as this is something the Palestinians have been asking for decades. It's not a big deal in so much as it's virtually meaningless. Nobody is going to really change how they approach the Israel-Palestine issue writ large because they recognize a Palestinian state. Israel still has pretty much all of the power over the Palestinians. And I don't think anybody is sufficiently sympathetic to the Palestinians to want to actually help them build their state. Certainly not in the face of Israeli opposition. So it is kind of a big deal in a historical context, but in a practical context, this is not going to matter. This is purely symbolic.
I see.
Netanyahu gave a speech at the UN just kind of ranting about international recognition of a Palestinian state and how it's rewarding bad behavior. Nothing unusual there. I almost didn't add it to the notes. It's kind of irrelevant. But it is sort of the official response by the Israeli government to international recognition of the Palestinians. So I threw it in anyway. Let's see. Got a little bit of a Ukraine update, nothing too big, just some stupid drama in Denmark. There's been some drones that have been flown over some airports, forcing the airports to temporarily shut down until the airspace could be cleared. And it's happened 3 times now. So the suspicion is that this is some kind of hybrid warfare by the Russian government. This is what people in the Danish government have been describing it as. And so there's concern that maybe this is an effort by Russia to intimidate the Danish government and otherwise undermine their economy, basically a form of harassment. There's no actual proof of Russian involvement as of yet, so this could be anything. It could just be teenagers, for all we know. But the Danish government insists that some kind of professional element is responsible for it. And again, they seem to suspect that it is Moscow. So pending proof, I'm a little hesitant to say it's the Russians. But I think even without knowing who's directly responsible, you can say that this is a pretty clear-cut example of the degree of paranoia that exists in Europe about Russian intentions. Certainly that seems to be an increasingly rather consistent through line as far as the perception of Russia in Western Europe. Let's see, similar vein, there were 2 teenagers arrested in the Netherlands for espionage. Apparently they were caught carrying around some Wi-Fi sniffers in their backpacks, specifically carrying them around some sensitive sites.
What is a Wi-Fi sniffer?
Good question. Honestly, I have no idea. My impression is that it's designed to surveil Wi-Fi traffic, which I think is a thing you can do. But I've never looked up the specific definition for Wi-Fi sniffers, so I shall defer to chat on this. I'm sure we've got some tech-savvy people who will know better than I. But basically, they were charged for engaging in illegal surveillance of sensitive sites. That's basically what the alleged espionage was about. And I think in this case, they did directly link it to a Russian agent.
Interesting. Chat saying the drone situation in Denmark was not just there, it was in Norway too. And they're saying it's not teenagers, the drones are not hobby tech level.
Okay. I had not heard about the Norway case. I'd only heard about Denmark. Let's see, the only other thing on Ukraine I had is that apparently at some point, Panama revoked the registration of more than 200 Russian tankers, basically oil tankers. I had not been aware of that. It makes sense. You know, the Panama government is significantly, how do I put this? The United States government has a lot of influence over Panama's government, so it makes sense that they would do something for Ukraine. And one of the main sort of ways that Panama can influence international trade is through ship registration. The Panamanian government makes a lot of money from the registration of ships because it's relatively easy and cheap in Panama to do so, which is why such a disproportionately large share of international cargo ships of one kind or another are actually flagged in Panama or Greece or one of the other places where registration is super cheap. So revoking that registration is not necessarily too big of a problem since they can just register elsewhere, but it does make things at least a little more inconvenient for the Russian shadow fleet.
Shadow fleet.
Yeah, it sounds
the
cool,
Chinese
doesn't it?
shadow banks. Where do you get your money? In the shadow bank. Really? Do you have to use like a special cloak to walk in there? No, it's just a bank, but it's not part of the usual kind of institutions in the country.
I know. Yeah, but that's all I had for Ukraine for this week. Let's see, trade update. We did get some recent drama on trade. Most of it stupid, so not especially unusual. But you'll probably be reading about it in the news within, what is it? The next 2 weeks, I would guess. So the Trump administration is saying that it's got a new slate of tariffs it's going to implement, I should say, starting October the 5th, I think. And this encompasses a couple of categories. I'll kind of go through them here. Probably the most notable involves goods containing chips. So this is not tariffs on semiconductors or other forms of computer chip. This is a tariff on goods containing the chips. So like computers, graphics cards, or any kind of electronic form of electronics that contains a computer chip would be subject to this new tariff. And the idea here is to improve the protectionist wall that the administration is sort of haphazardly trying to build in order to incentivize production. within the United States. Basically, the idea here is that a tariff on computer chips is not sufficient. Because if you really want to, you can get around the tariff on computer chips by just importing a lot of stuff that has chips in it. This is actually one of the ways that China has circumvented American export restrictions. You're not legally allowed to buy American chips of one kind or another because of the export restrictions. However, what if there's like a computer or something that has those chips in it? Technically, at least until relatively recently, they could still buy those. So what they could do is buy a lot of those, take the chips out, and then apply them to something else. Obviously, this doesn't work as well with something like artificial intelligence chips, because there's not a lot of consumer items that can be cheaply acquired that have those in them. But for other forms of chips that have been banned, you kind of could do that. So the US government wants to try to close that loophole, at least in terms of protectionism, to ensure that American consumers don't get around the tariff on foreign chips by just buying foreign goods that have chips in them and then extracting the chips for whatever usage. So this would be, from what I've read thus far anyway, a 15% tariff on electronics from Japan and the European Union. Although these figures are preliminary and are always subject to negotiation, we'll see what kind of quote-unquote framework agreements and then subsequent quote-unquote deals come out of this. But for now, it's being stated as 15% for allies, Japan and the European Union, and then 25% for everybody else. The Commerce Department was apparently talking about a potential exemption based off of investment in US manufacturing. Basically, if you were a company that wanted to get around the hypothetical new tariff that they're going to implement, you could do so by investing in some US manufacturing. You didn't necessarily have to completely move your entire manufacturing operation to the US, but the more you did move, the greater your exemption for those goods that you did continue to export into the United States. However, Donald Trump himself apparently doesn't like the idea of exemptions, so this may not happen. And this dislike for exemptions apparently extends to exemptions that the Commerce Department wanted for chip-making tools. So if you do want a chip-making industry in the United States, you're going to have to import the tools that are used to make them, the capital equipment, the actual manufacturing factory equipment. And the Commerce Department very correctly figured that if they wanted to incentivize production here, it made sense to exempt the producers of that kind of equipment from tariffs. Trump has apparently negated that, disagrees with that. And so they will also, hypothetically, if these tariffs go through, be subject to it, which is very self-defeating, as we've discussed at length before. But he is at least consistently self-defeating in that regard. So maybe not that unpredictable. So we'll see if computers get another spike in prices on account of the new tariffs. It kind of spiked earlier when he was talking more about tariffing chips and countries in general that exported a lot of electronics into the United States. We may be back in that boat again pretty soon. So I hope none of you are looking to upgrade your computer after Windows 10 expires, because if you are, you may find it very expensive in the coming weeks. I'm probably just going to pay for the extension.
Gamers in shambles.
Let's see. I don't know if you've heard of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, but basically this is a trade agreement that was implemented in 2015, which effectively allows almost all of Africa privileged access to the US market. They qualify for lower tariffs than they would have otherwise. And this was meant as a concession to help Africa develop economically. It might sound controversial, but it wasn't really that big of a concession because Africa doesn't really produce a lot of stuff that competes directly with goods and services produced in the United States. So not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, but it was helpful to Africa. The Trump administration, the current Trump administration, early in the second term here, I think did technically suspend it effectively by raising tariffs on everybody. But since the tariff drama has kind of subsided and basically everybody gets 10% now, I think the AGOA agreement is technically in effect still. However, the original bill that created AGOA was sunsetted for 2025. It was basically just meant to last 10 years with the potential to renew it if Congress wanted to. So, of course, the big question, given that the Trump administration is famously protectionist, is whether or not they will support or oppose this, because, of course, congressional Republicans are very, very much enthralled to Trump at the moment. So where he weighs on this is probably going to be pretty decisive. Interestingly, the Trump administration, specifically figures within the Trump administration's Commerce Department, have said that they're willing to renew it. They're willing to support the renewal of the agreement because they broadly, quote unquote, support the goals of the agreement. They apparently do have some quibbles with certain aspects of it that they want addressed. But beyond that, they seem to be trending towards renewal, which would be very helpful for Africa. So this could be an example of the administration preferring free trade over protectionism, although you have to caveat that with whatever quid pro quo they're inevitably going to ask for. And we don't know what that's going to be yet. So we'll have to wait and see to judge what that looks like in practice. But hypothetically, they are at least signaling early here a willingness to facilitate continued free trade with Africa specifically, if not by extension, the broader developing world. Let's see, we got some more details on that bizarre investment fund that was supposed to be a part of the trade deal that was agreed between the United States government and the Japanese government. This was back when Trump was in full deal-making mode vis-a-vis trade with a variety of countries. And it was a pretty alarming agreement when I first read about it, because the fund is supposed to be $550 billion, which is a huge amount for Japan. That's like a good chunk of their annual US budget. I mean, annual national budget, government budget. So it wasn't clear to me if this was an actual thing or just meant to generate a headline, because I don't know how Japan pays for a $550 billion investment package in just a few months or even in a year. So my assumption is either that this was never going to happen, or that if it did happen, that it was going to be delayed for a period of years, and then that the $550 billion would be stretched out over 10 years, so that it would be more like $55 billion a year for 10 years, something like that. And that they would probably have a very broad definition for what constitutes investment. So it seems, as more details come out, that's kind of what they were doing, but it's still not entirely clear. We know now that they're going to try to focus on strategic sectors. They had said they would do that, but they've announced specific sectors now. Chips, metals, presumably critical materials or something to that effect. Pharmaceuticals, energy, and shipbuilding will all be priorities. Let's see, and these investments have to be made supposedly by January 2029. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's what they're saying. Let's see. And yeah, they're going to focus on those things. They're supposedly going to use a state-owned development bank to do this. So it's going to be a new entity, but it'll be owned by the Japanese government. And it's going to be funded by a combination of money from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation and the Nippon Export and Investment Insurance Company, I assume. And it's not going to just include cash, it's also going to include equity, loans, and loan guarantees. So those are all things that you can kind of put up as collateral in order to fund investment projects overseas. So I'm guessing what they're going to do is they're going to take existing XM entities like Nexi or an existing development bank, take funds from that, and then take funds from the general budget in order to create seed money for the new development bank, which will most likely, almost inevitably, be way less than $550 billion. And they'll start up and then they'll start after probably a year or two, I would guess, to invest in projects in the United States proper, probably projects that involve Japanese companies, and possibly, if my intuition is correct about how these things work, they'll probably fund stuff that Japanese companies were already wanting to do, and we're already going to get finance from normal outlets to do. But now we'll get from the Japanese government so that the government can claim that it's funding investment into the United States. I'm sure the Japanese government will argue that over the course of 5 years, 10 years, whatever the deadline ends up being, that all of the investment will add up to $550 billion. But most likely, again, I'm guessing, but if my intuition is correct, they're going to delay for time. And then when they start investing, it'll be relatively small amounts. And they're going to hope that in the long term, something happens with Trump or the US government generally, and then they can kind of just scrap it or otherwise significantly reduce the commitment to the $550 billion, basically. Yeah, apparently the... Huh? Oh, yeah.
A lot of money.
That is a massive amount of money for a moderately sized developed country like Japan. Even though it is developed and has a lot of money, a large economy, like 550 bill, man, that's a lot. Yeah, apparently the the Japan Bank for International Corporation already did have permission, basically as part of its charter, to extend loans to companies or projects in developing countries. So basically what they're going to do is create a copy of the JBIC here, but just shift the priority from developing countries to developed countries. Okay, so a couple other items here. So the tariffs proposed for October the 5th do not just encompass electronics. They're also going to potentially, if the announcement is accurate, going to encompass 3 other categories: furniture, heavy trucks, pharmaceuticals. So the announcement says that there's going to be 50% tariffs on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and quote-unquote associated products, and 30% on upholstered furniture. I guess kitchen cabinets are not furniture, so I should amend that. But that's the gist of it. Furniture and household items of one kind or another, fixtures, if you will. All of those will be subject to much higher tariffs. The United States used to have a relatively large furniture manufacturing ecosystem, but almost all of them migrated out to China or other places. So the Trump administration presumably wants to bring some of that back by raising tariffs. I don't think it's going to work because that is to say the production of furniture and fixtures and whatnot is relatively labor intensive. You can have some automation, some CapEx that can kind of cover that. But ultimately, it comes down to dudes in a factory kind of carving shapes out of wood or metal, depending on what you're making your furniture or fixture out of. So being relatively labor intensive, and given that the industry is relatively low margin, it's not like a super profitable industry to be in, I don't think it's really viable as an industry in the United States. Even with tariffs, I think it'll be very hard to make that happen outside of very specific premium niches of the market. So most likely the effect here is not going to so much be reshoring, so to speak. More like it's going to be attracting these industries to countries that will continue to enjoy privileged access to the US market. So basically Mexico is my suspicion. Probably a lot of producers that are still in China, or more likely those that have since migrated out of China because of rising cost of wages to Southeast Asia, where a lot of them have gone. I think those of them that sell a lot to the United States will probably just outsource production to Mexico, since Mexico, on account of the USMCA agreement, or CUSMA agreement, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, all three parties have different names for it. On account of that, they'll be able to take advantage of low discounted tariffs. And so Mexico, I think, is going to be the big beneficiary there. Now, you could argue that that's still worth doing because it means that at least the manufacturing is closer to the United States. But whether or not a given item is being manufactured in a friendly country versus China is really only relevant with regard to products that have national security significance. And I don't really count kitchen cabinets as part of that category. So I think for the Trump administration, this is just more posturing for the most part. I don't think there's going to be significant reshoring here. At most, there's going to be friendshoring, but this is not going to have a dramatic impact on either the US economy or the strategic balance between China and the United States. I'm not even really sure why this is a priority in the first place. Again, I just have to assume it's the symbolism. An industry that used to be in the US but is now not because of free trade will now be protected, even though it's almost certainly not coming back. So that's furniture and kitchen cabinets and et cetera. Heavy trucks, 25%. I have no idea why. This was already protected. There was an agreement with the Europeans back in the 70s that basically allowed the United States to have higher tariffs on trucks, specifically heavy trucks. So a further 25% is not really changing the dynamic there. This is already a class of vehicle that is so protected that it's become the mainstay for many American manufacturers, many American automotive manufacturers in the United States. And it's not a space that foreign producers are really even competitive in, as I understand it. So higher tariffs here doesn't really help anybody except maybe politically connected car companies that want to take what little market share foreign producers have in that market. That's my best guess, because otherwise I don't see this as actually reshoring anything. The US already, as I understand it, produces the vast majority of heavy trucks that are consumed in the US. And that brings us to pharmaceuticals. So the tariff here is going to be 100%. 100% tariffs on branded drugs.
Wow.
This is going to be a problem for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. If you do have some drug that is only produced overseas and you need it for your health, paying 100% more for it is going to be a problem. So your best case scenario is that insurance covers most of it. But if you're familiar with American healthcare institutions, you know that they tend to be pretty predatory. So I'm not really optimistic about the impact this is going to have on the pharmaceutical market in the United States. That said, if you want to look past the inflationary impact this is going to have, this is probably the area where tariffs, in so much as they're intended to reshore manufacturing, could be the most successful. Because the production of pharmaceuticals is relatively capital intensive, as I understand it. And it's also relatively high margin. So what that means is that you can produce in an area where the cost of production is relatively higher and still turn a pretty good profit. And the United States already has a comparative advantage in terms of capital intensive manufacturing. So of all the stuff that the Trump administration is tariffing to try to incentivize reshoring of manufacturing capacity, pharmaceuticals could be the one that works the best. I think the principal issue here is going to be more the short-term impact, given how sensitive the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical imports are to the health of many people. This does have the potential to generate a lot of political pushback for the administration. But when they don't give a shit about political pushback, then they've tended to exhibit a significant immunity to it. So they could just push this through and let it ride out, regardless of the consequences. That remains to be seen. But of the things to be tariffed, besides electronics, pharmaceuticals could be the one that ends up having some of the most dramatic short-term effects, if they do actually follow through with this. We'll see if they do. But definitely keep your eye on that space.
Drugs are very expensive. And they could be more expensive.
Do you really want the highlight reel?
Oh, is it a bad one or is it usual?
It's not a bad one. It's just, it's always the same sort of generically dumb shit. All of it always has the potential to be more significant. So there is some reason to talk about it, but 90% of the time there's no follow-up, and it's just kayfabe. So it's at your discretion if you want it this week. We should do it occasionally, but I don't know if every week is necessarily justified.
We could let it pile on for another week, maybe.
Fair enough. Let's see, did we have any more questions? No.
There was one question from chat. Have you talked about every U.S. general getting called for a meeting in Virginia? Or the changing press laws where it comes to military stuff?
I forgot to put that in the highlight reel, actually. That should be here. Yeah, I have not talked about it, but if I had, it would have been part of the highlight reel, although I might have saved it for next week since I forgot to add it here. Summon to Washington. Yeah, I did read about it, and basically the Secretary of Defense has asked, I think something like 1,000 generals, a multitude of high-ranking flag officers, to travel physically to Washington for a meeting. And for much of the past week, it was kind of a mystery why. We still don't we still don't actually know what it's going to be about. But there was some signaling about it in the past few days, and apparently he wants to give a speech about warrior ethos to them, which had a lot of the internet chortling, because a lot of these guys that he's going to be talking to have way more actual combat experience than he does. He himself was, I think, briefly in the military, and I don't believe was ever an officer. So the idea that he's going to teach a bunch of flag officers with decades of experience about warrior ethos, I don't know, it seems very strange. I'm not sure what the point of that is. But Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, has an established pattern of prioritizing basically political showmanship type stuff. He is a former political pundit. He was a talking head on Fox for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me that stuff like this is important to him. But it is just goofy bullshit. You know, for anybody who is an actual professional in the military, stuff like this is almost always a waste of time. This stuff is being done more for domestic political consumption than it is for the benefit of the actual military. Now, it could be that there's some other reason that he has to talk to them, but if it's something other than the warrior ethos thing, we don't know about it. It remains to be seen. There are, of course, paranoid people on the internet that think this is sort of laying the groundwork for a coup attempt or something. There's always going to be talk like that, especially in a hyper-partisan political environment. But probably it is just dumb shit. That would be my expectation. But we'll see. We'll see what comes of it.
Chad asked if there was anything about the Comey indictment.
That was in the highlight reel too. Yeah, I don't have anything new on it. I just know that, we can just briefly talk about it. Trump wanted to go after Comey. He wants to bring a case against him. But his attorney generals in his first term did not want to do it. And apparently his attorney general in this term did not want to do it for the same reasons, which is that there's just not enough of a case there to warrant it. And when his current quote unquote attorney general refused to do it, he actually just straight up fired them. And the new guy that replaced him did bring the charges against Comey. Now, that's a big deal if anybody cares about institutions anymore, which I guess I'm in an increasingly small minority in regard to that. The Department of Justice is supposed to be an independent institution. It's not supposed to be an arm of the executive, right? It's not supposed to be something that the president tells what to do. They are supposed to receive appointments from the president. They can receive general guidance. but they are not supposed to just take orders from the president, especially on politically sensitive matters. This has been a norm in the Department of Justice for generations. This is a very old established norm, and that existed for a very good reason, which is that if you do allow an executive to politicize the Department of Justice, he can weaponize it, something that Trump himself ostensibly doesn't want the government doing. So that norm is broken now, and the Department of Justice now is very clearly just going after people that Trump doesn't like. And I don't think the fact that they have brought the charges means that their case is any stronger than it was before. The point of cases that are obviously not going to succeed in this vein is just to harass the target. Even if you're going to win, it still takes time, it takes money, and there's always the possibility that you might lose, which creates anxiety. So when sort of illiberal democracies do this, it's almost always used as a way to intimidate dissidents of one kind or another. Comey is not a dissident. He's just somebody who Trump perceives as some kind of personal enemy. He's got some kind of weird grudge left over from the Russiagate thing back in the day. So for those reasons, he seems to want some kind of retribution. And so legal harassment seems to be the tool he's settled on. And having enemies and harassing them is not necessarily unusual in politics, but in American politics, historically, it's been very much frowned upon as a slippery slope that leads to bad places. And the norm in the Department of Justice was meant to immunize or at least mitigate that possibility. And now all of that shit has gone right out the window. If another president had done this in a previous administration, it would have been front page news and people would never hear the end of it. Here, it's just Tuesday. So more institutional rot here is the significance of the Comey indictment, or not indictment, the Comey charges. Yeah, there's a pretty good chance the case just gets thrown out because Trump himself has basically all but openly admitted the charges are politically motivated. So any impartial judge will probably see that and say, okay, well, then we're not going to do this.
Or what? Second year of this administration? Or is this the first? Oh no, it's the first. He's laughing.
Yeah, first year.
Okay.
You get 3 more and change. You've got much to look forward to.
Oh.
Hey, whatever happens, just remember, people got what they voted for. This is a victory for democracy. This is exactly what his supporters wanted, so you can't complain. It's not like nobody didn't warn everybody. There were lots of discussions in that vein. Let's see, Trump drama aside, of which there is always an abundant amount. I haven't talked about China in a while, but I don't really have a lot to go into. China's thing is that they're kind of caught in a doom loop. They're just sort of perpetually trying to deal with their economic problems, but they don't have any good tools with which to do so. And so things just sort of drag on interminably. Their industrial policy has been very successful. It seems to be generating results. But the downside, the costs of that policy have become increasingly apparent. Have I talked to you about deflation in China recently?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this is one of the developments in China's economy over the past couple years, which has become a prominent aspect of the Chinese economy. So because the Chinese government is pumping so much money into its industrial policy, a lot of companies that are receiving that money are incentivized to just produce stuff. It doesn't matter how much the market wants. It doesn't matter how much it costs. The Chinese government just wants production in order to move up the learning curve and to try to move into relatively high value goods that it thinks are important. But that production is happening now at such a scale that it's actually causing prices to collapse in those industries. And a lot of companies in those industries are really struggling financially as a result. They are basically almost completely dependent on government support at this point via the levers of industrial policy, because the market for this stuff is just crashing. Stuff is incredibly cheap that is getting subsidized. And it's so bad that it's having knock-on effects on the broader economy. Because obviously, if you can't charge enough to cover the cost of your goods, that means you don't need to produce as much. But because you're dependent on the industrial policy, you have to produce more, and so wages end up getting the brunt of it. And so wages get cut, people don't make as much money, consumption falls, and then you end up with an overall economy that is even less consumption-driven than it already was. And China has been struggling for decades with the fact that its economy is principally investment-driven, not consumption-driven. So the need to transition to a consumption-driven economy is recognized by the Chinese government, but that need is in direct conflict with the government's prioritization of the industrial policy. So the Chinese government, in turn, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do we ease up on the industrial policy and then pursue the consumption transition? Or alternatively, do we maintain our current industrial policy because we see it as strategically and politically necessary, but then fail to transition to a consumption-driven economy and continue to suffer the vices and problems of having to continue to rely disproportionately on investment? There's not really any good answer there for the Communist Party of China that does not involve some kind of disruption to the overall economy or to their strategic independence or to the party's legitimacy or some combination thereof. So deflation, just falling prices from overproduction, that's one of the defining traits of the Chinese economy right now. And it facilitates low wages that are effectively suppressed by this. And so it's harder for people to find work. It's harder for people to find work when they do that has good wages. And the overall vibe in China overall on account of all this is pretty negative. People are not really optimistic about the trajectory of the Chinese economy. It is technically growing 4 to 5% per year. Even if you account for fudging data, like the Chinese economy is actually doing relatively well overall. The trouble is that most of those gains are happening in very particular regions with very particular companies. It is not prosperity that is being broadly shared across the population evenly. And so even most people who have college degrees at this point are struggling to make it. They find it very difficult to find good work. And it's created a lot of very jaded citizens on account of it. But it's an authoritarian political system, so there's not much they can do to express it. There's not really much good work around, so a lot of them either end up having to grind with low-wage work, or they just drop out. Start living as what they call on the Chinese internet, professional children. Just kind of living at home with their parents, but otherwise not really doing anything.
Yeah, it seems like it's not ideal having your wages go down. Also makes it really hard for you to travel or kind of invest in areas outside of your own country if your country's currency is low due to overproduction.
Well, it's not their currency that's low. Actually, their currency has been increasing in value a little bit. It's the prices of things in China that have been declining. The overall rate of inflation is very low. In fact, it's negative. Yeah, historically, deflation has not been seen, well, has been seen as an even bigger problem than inflation. I think everybody at this point is familiar with why inflation sucks. Everything is more expensive. You can't buy as much with your wages, and your wages tend to lag inflation. So when prices do go up, generally it just means an absolute decline in the overall amount you can consume in a given time period. So people hate it. Deflation, however, even if it sounds attractive because stuff is getting cheaper, which presumably increases your purchasing power, it's actually much more of a problem because governments and monetary institutions can't really stop it. They're not as familiar with how to address deflation than they are with inflation. And the policy tools available to deal with it are much weaker. So when you do experience deflation, it's considered a very bad sign that the economy is really struggling, and generally you don't get to enjoy the benefit of lower prices, because what often happens is that you lose your job because of the overall decline in economic activity that facilitates the decline in prices. Now, in China's case, that's not why they're experiencing deflation. For them, it's just industrial policy. They're paying people to crank out stuff, and it's just deflating the overall market.
Like the government is paying the companies to make stuff?
Exactly. Yeah, they're subsidizing production in order to encourage the development and production of certain types of goods that the government considers to be priorities, mostly because it wants to be self-sufficient in technologies that it thinks are going to be the technologies of the future, so that it's not dependent on imports, such that a foreign power that could control those imports cuts them off in order to pressure the Chinese government. It's a strategic thing, not an economic thing.
Yeah, wanting to be self-reliant. That makes sense.
Yeah. So electric vehicles are important, not so much, I think, because the Chinese government thinks electric vehicles are going to be like a big wave of the future all over the world. You know, they could be, but I think the Chinese government is just more interested in cutting its import of oil. China is the world's largest importer of oil, and a good chunk of it goes towards just fueling cars in China. So if they could switch over to an all-electric vehicle setup where everybody's driving EVs instead of traditional combustion engine cars, that would significantly curb the amount of oil the Chinese economy needs to import every year. And in turn, that would make the Chinese government much less vulnerable to instability in the Middle East, and much less vulnerable to a potential cutoff of imports of any kind that come through the Straits of Malacca, which is a choke point that is de facto controlled by the US Navy right now. Semiconductors is basically the same thing. If China can be self-sufficient in computer chips, semiconductors, et cetera, that significantly reduces the pressure that the West collectively could bring to bear on them, since that is one of the most high-value, important items that it still continues to import from the West in large volumes. Clean tech, similar. That is a potential industry of the future that could be a dominant global trade item of one kind or another, depending on what you're talking about. But also, just pollution in China was very bad for a long time. So clean energy was a priority also for that reason. So that's where you see that's why you see Chinese dominance in solar panels, wind power, et cetera, stuff like that. They made it a priority early on. It had pretty much dominated those spaces.
So all of that clarification, is deflation bad for the economy for corporations, regular people, or both?
Both. Because keep in mind, traditionally deflation happens because the economy is in decline. It's in recession or is slowing down. That means less economic activity. Less economic activity means less overall demand for products. And it's because of that decrease in demand for products that prices decline. That is the usual formula for deflation. Again, China is an exception because they're generating deflation as a result of direct government policy. But organic deflation just happens because of economic decline. So that's bad for, obviously, regular people because it means they're losing their jobs. And it's bad for corporations because it means they're not selling as much. So the revenue and profits are in decline. So nobody really likes deflation that much, unless you're one of the few people who manages to keep their job through a deflationary cycle, in which case you have the same amount of income, but everything is cheaper. So for those people, it's actually pretty nice. However, it creates a disincentive to consume as well. This was long thought to be a problem in Japan during their long stagnation. If you know that prices are decreasing over time, why would you buy something right now? Would it not make more sense to buy it later when the price falls further? Mm-hmm. There's an incentive then to not consume things and to instead wait to consume. That's another problem with deflation, because not only are prices falling because of whatever economic issue is causing the economy to decline, but the mere presence of deflation itself disincentivizes consumption and so further reduces demand, which creates a kind of negative virtual cycle, so to speak, in which things start getting bad and then progressively get worse. It's a kind of ratchet effect.
I see. You don't hear about it talked as much as inflation, at least from an American perspective.
Yeah, generally, again, if there's deflation, there's a recession. And if there's a recession, that's what people talk about. People don't care as much about prices falling as they do losing their jobs. And generally, the two are correlated. Mm-hmm. So it's not that deflation hasn't happened or been talked about. It's just that when it has happened, everybody's talking about the recession instead.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of deflation during the Great Recession, the big 2008 financial crisis that happened, 17 years ago? Yeah, 17 years ago. Wow. Yeah, there was a lot of deflation during that, but people didn't talk about that. People obviously much more concerned with mass layoffs of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. How are we doing on time?
Well, that about does it. We're at 2 hours 50, so we could wrap up here.
Okay. Well, how about one last fun fact about the economy? I was reading about this just recently.
Green light.
The top 10% of income earners in the United States are now responsible for 50% of all consumption in the United States.
Consumption? Wow.
Yeah. That's a huge amount. That's a historical high.
What are they consuming? It's like houses, cars, travel?
Yeah, just consumption refers to general consumption by consumers of any kind. So basically economic demand from consumers in an economy. Huh. So historically, it was a little more even. I mean, the top income earners have always been big consumers. That's not unusual. But generally, it's more like 30 to 40%. I think that's what it was back in like the 80s, 90s. But now, partly because of inequality, partly because the U.S. is kind of a gold-plated economy at this point, the upper middle class and the upper class have way more purchasing power than they used to have. And so their proportion of overall consumption has risen to unusually high levels.
Today I learned. I know our income disparity has been increasing over time, especially with the mega turbo rich, like the Bezos, Zuckerberg types.
Yeah, that's part of it. But keep in mind that a good chunk of that is also upper middle class. They're not the top 10% of earners per se, but they're in there. A portion of that is. And part of the reason the U.S. economy has grown so much over time is that the upper middle class, as a proportion of the population, has actually grown to bizarrely large portions. So that's not an inherently bad thing. It is actually easier now, not harder, to get into the upper middle class if you look at it just in terms of the portion of the population that class comprises. There has been some growth in the lower working class as well, and that's generally what people who talk about inequality focus on. But that's not the full story. Like, both ends of the spectrum have actually grown, and the middle has kind of hollowed out more. But there has been significant growth in people with not elite incomes, but just like professional incomes. That has grown disproportionately, and that just has to do with the U.S. economy being exposed over a prolonged period to global competition, such that our comparative advantage has been supercharged. The U.S. economy specializes in high-end stuff, like the premium end production of stuff in a manufacturing sense, but even more so in the services sector, things like design, the legal side of things, high-end engineering, whatever you can think of that's high-value services, the U.S. probably has a comparative advantage in. And those industries have all been supercharged by globalization. And because they're disproportionately large and influential in the United States, the class of workers that they employ has correspondingly also been engorged, so to speak, and become a disproportionately large portion of the US population. It's kind of a tale of two cities, because on the one hand, the upper middle class has grown to like ahistorical highs, which is a good thing, but that has to be contrasted with the disparity, the geographic disparity, the income disparity that has corresponded with that. So the working class has kind of borne the brunt of that in a myriad of ways. So for example, it used to be that if you were a working class American 50 years ago, you could go to a baseball game, get a hot dog, take your family to the movies. All of that would be relatively cheap because it was priced for a working class income. You know, that's where the bulk of the demand was. But with the emergence and engorgement of the upper middle class, now all of that stuff is priced more for them because it's more profitable to do so. They are so large a class now that you can just center those industries almost purely around their tastes and preferences. And you won't lose money like you would have if you'd done that 50 years ago. Now, if you're upper middle class, that's kind of fine. You can afford that stuff. But if you're working class, you're kind of fucked. You're basically priced out of a lot of stuff that had been traditional forms of recreation for the American working class. And so increasingly, they've been pushed out into other things. That feels like things are getting worse for them, even though if you actually look at the data, the American working class is not necessarily getting worse. It kind of depends on how you want to look at it. But in general, in real income terms, the decline is relatively mild. And if you look at real income in terms of post-tax real income, it's actually either stagnant or has improved, albeit only mildly. So the plight of the lower working class or the lower class or the working class, you know, nobody likes to call themselves lower class in the United States. So it's always middle class or working class. But the lower end of the middle class, if you want to call it that, has been growing. But people tend to mischaracterize it as being absolutely crushed, when in reality, the pressure that they face in terms of inflation, recent inflation notwithstanding, is relatively on trend. I'm sure we could argue about that quite a bit, but this is the very end. So I'm sure there's a lot we can talk about next time if people really want to get into it. But in general, the US economy is doing very well. It's just not doing very well for everybody. But even the people who are not doing especially well are not really doing worse than they've ever done. In general, it's relatively flat in terms of change over time, as far as standard of living for the lower classes in the United States.
I see. Well, excellent. Chat, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate you very much. It's been a gorgeous subathon so far. Made it into the third week now. Always a pleasure having Agent Smith on, and for real, letting us do this work is a gift. So thank you for being our audience and asking questions and enhancing the show. Agent Smith, thank you for your time. You're an ace as always. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.